Imagine waking up and finally feeling no more walking on eggshells, no more constant tension in your chest, no more pretending to be okay just to keep the peace, just silence, peace, clarity. Sounds impossible? Not if you learn the ancient wisdom that helped warriors, emperors, and philosophers stay calm and in control, even when surrounded by chaos. Free. But let me ask you something. How many times have you stayed in a relationship, friendship, family, or romantic, knowing deep down that it was draining you, that it was messing with your peace, your confidence, your life? Maybe you thought walking away would cause too much drama. Maybe you felt guilty. Maybe you were waiting for them to change. But here's the truth. Waiting for someone else to change is the fastest way to stay stuck. That's where Stoicism comes in. The Stoics didn't waste time arguing, proving points, or begging people to respect them. They simply disengaged, quietly, powerfully, with full control over their emotions. Today, you're going to discover how to cut off toxic people without shouting, crying, or explaining yourself 100 times. No drama, no guilt, just strength, peace, and wisdom. These aren't just emotional survival tips. They're tested tools built to help you take your power back while staying calm, rational, and focused on what you can control. So get ready, because after this guide, you'll never handle toxic people the same way again. Before we begin, I want you to make a commitment to yourself. Write in the comments, "I choose peace." You're not just typing words, you're giving your mind a new direction. Say it, believe it, and let's begin. Most people think walking away means slamming a door, deleting a number, or cutting someone off from your life. But the real ending doesn't start there. It starts long before that moment. It starts in your mind, in silence, where no one else can see, where the real battles take place. That inner shift, the one no one notices, is the beginning of true freedom. It's the quiet decision that says, I no longer give this person the power to affect how I feel. That's the real goodbye. And that's where the Stoic path begins. Now, before you leave someone physically, you must first leave them mentally. You must withdraw your emotions like waves pulling back from the shore, calmly, quietly, but fully. This process is not cold, and it is not cruel. In fact, it is one of the most respectful things you can do, for yourself and even for the other person. Because staying emotionally involved when your peace is already gone only creates more pain, more confusion, more drama. Stoicism teaches us that the only thing we truly control is our own mind. And when you master that, no one can drag you into chaos unless you let them. When a toxic relationship pulls you in again and again, it's not just about their words or their actions. It's about your reaction. It's about the space they still occupy inside your thoughts. The conversations you keep replaying, the guilt you keep holding, the false hope that maybe, just maybe, things will change. But holding on emotionally keeps you trapped, even if you're physically apart. And walking away without emotional detachment, that's not freedom. It's just distance filled with tension. So the first step is stillness. Not action, not confrontation, just stillness. That stillness begins with recognizing the thoughts that pull you back into their world. The ones that whisper, maybe I misunderstood them, or what if I'm the problem? Or maybe they didn't mean it. These thoughts are not clarity. They are noise. Your mind is trying to justify your emotional attachment because it is afraid of loss. But what you are really afraid of is discomfort, not the person themselves. This is why Stoics practiced observation of thought. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and philosopher, wrote in his journal every day not to sound wise to others, but to examine his mind, to see what emotions ruled him, to challenge his own thinking. And that's what you must begin to do. Watch your mind. Notice the way it reacts to memories, messages, silence, or even the fear of letting go. Emotional withdrawal is not about pretending. It's not fake forgiveness or forced positivity. It's about stepping back from the storm of your feelings and looking at the situation with honesty. It means asking yourself, what am I trying to protect by holding on? What am I losing by not letting go? You might be holding on to a version of the person that only exists in your head. Or maybe you're holding on to the role you played in the relationship, the fixer, the giver, the loyal one. Maybe you're afraid that without them, you'll have to face something in yourself you've been avoiding. All of that needs to be brought to light, because until you do, you won't be leaving a person. You'll just be dragging the emotional weight of them wherever you go. This is not easy. Emotional withdrawal is not fast. It is a daily practice, and it doesn't look like anything on the outside. You could still be showing up to work, still talking to them, still making dinner, but something in you has shifted. You're no longer trying to change them. You're no longer waiting for an apology. You've stopped feeding the cycle. That's detachment. Detachment isn't coldness. It's clarity. It's what happens when you finally realize that your peace matters more than proving your point, more than being right, more than being seen as the good guy. The Stoics knew that being ruled by emotion is like being a puppet on strings. People can control you just by pulling the right ones. But when you withdraw emotionally, the strings go limp. Their anger no longer moves you. Their silence no longer haunts you. Their approval no longer defines you. Let's be honest. Sometimes the hardest people to detach from are not the ones who hurt us the most, but the ones who gave us just enough hope to keep us close. The ones who made us feel special, then punished us with silence. The ones who gave attention in small doses so we would chase more. This kind of emotional manipulation is not always loud. Sometimes it's so quiet you almost don't notice it. That's why detachment has to start from the inside, so you can see clearly what you're really dealing with. Think about this. Would a healthy relationship make you question your worth? Would a kind person use your empathy against you? Would someone who truly respects you make you feel small just to feel powerful themselves? If the answer is no, then what exactly are you holding on to? Detachment is not losing something. It's seeing what was never truly there in the first place. You might feel guilt. That's normal, especially if you've been conditioned to believe that setting boundaries makes you selfish, or that staying in difficult relationships is a sign of loyalty. But guilt is not always a signal that you've done something wrong. Sometimes it's a leftover feeling from an old belief that no longer serves you. The Stoics called this external opinion, the ideas society pushes on us that cloud our reason. And Epictetus, one of the greatest Stoic teachers, reminded us that our job is to focus only on what is up to us. Other people's judgments, not our concern. So let go of the guilt. Let go of the need to explain yourself to people who aren't trying to understand you. Let go of the fantasy that if you just try harder, things will get better. You're not giving up, you're choosing peace. And that is strength, not weakness. There's another layer to emotional withdrawal that many people overlook. Releasing the identity you had in that relationship. Sometimes we become so attached to who we were with that person, supportive, patient, self-sacrificing, that we don't know who we are without them. That's why detachment is also an identity shift. It's reclaiming the parts of you that got buried. It's stepping out of a role and becoming a full person again. You begin to ask different questions. What do I want for myself? What brings me joy? What kind of relationships actually nourish me? These questions are not selfish. They are necessary. Because if you don't define your values, your peace, your limits, someone else will. And here's the truth. The mind clings when it hasn't been trained to let go. Stoics trained daily. They practiced discomfort on purpose. They imagined loss, not to suffer, but to be ready. This practice, called premeditatio malorum, was their way of saying, if this happens, I will not fall apart. You can do the same. Start with simple things. Every time your mind wants to replay the past, gently bring it back to the present. Every time you feel the urge to reach out for closure, remind yourself that closure is not a conversation, it's a decision. Every time guilt tries to pull you back, ask, is this feeling based on reason or fear? Day by day, thought by thought, you become less reactive. And one day you wake up and realize you're no longer waiting for their message. You're no longer holding your breath in their presence. You're no longer shaping your day around their moods. That's the sign. That's when you know the mind has withdrawn. You are free. And when that happens, when your peace no longer depends on how they treat you, that's when you're finally ready to leave. Because now, your departure is not an escape. It's a conscious step towards something better. You're not running, you're releasing. Not out of anger, not out of pain, but out of clarity. You don't need a dramatic exit. You don't need to explain yourself 20 times. You don't need to make sure they understand why you're leaving. That's ego, and ego is loud. Detachment is quiet. You're not trying to win, you're trying to live. And that requires peace. So the next time someone tells you to just walk away, remember this. The body follows the mind. If you haven't detached emotionally, you're still holding on, even if your back is turned. And if you have withdrawn the mind, the rest becomes simple. Not easy, but simple. This is not a technique. It's a way of life, a practice of presence, clarity, and calm. You train your mind like a Stoic, not to feel less, but to feel right. To stop being pulled by chaos and start being anchored in your own reason. No yelling, no drama, just you reclaiming your peace, quietly, powerfully. And when you master this first step, when you truly withdraw the mind, you'll find that the rest doesn't need to be forced. You'll know when to go. And more importantly, you'll know how to stay gone, not in bitterness, not in fear, but in peace. Because in the end, that's what the Stoic path is all about. Not reacting to life, but responding with wisdom. And when you do that, no toxic person can hold power over you again. Sometimes the most powerful choice is the one you make in silence. After all the inner work, after pulling back your emotions, reclaiming your peace, and no longer responding to chaos with chaos, there comes a moment when action must follow. But not the loud, dramatic kind that the world often expects. Not the kind that's filled with final speeches, slammed doors, or long explanations. The Stoic path teaches something much quieter, much deeper, and far more effective. Departure without noise. The truth is, most people don't leave. They perform their exit. They need others to witness it, to validate it, to agree with it. They look for an audience to prove they were right, or a confrontation to make the other person see their worth. But here's the problem. If you need someone to see you leave in order to feel at peace, you're still tied to their reaction. You're still seeking closure through their approval. And that's not freedom. It's another kind of dependence. When you've truly detached within, you don't leave with a bang. You leave with a breath, quietly, intentionally, without needing to be seen or heard. That's not weakness, it's maturity. Because the person who no longer needs attention to validate their choices is someone who has reached a level of strength that chaos cannot reach. Leaving quietly does not mean avoiding. It means choosing your peace over performance. It means stepping away without making yourself a victim or a villain. It means understanding that the truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be lived. One of the reasons people struggle with quiet exits is because we've been taught that leaving without a fight means you were never serious. That silence means you didn't care. But this belief is based on drama, not wisdom. It is possible to care deeply and still walk away without noise. The Stoics showed us that virtue is not measured by volume, but by clarity. A calm mind is not a passive one, it's a powerful one. It acts when necessary, but never from a place of emotional instability. To walk away without seeking validation is to recognize that your decision does not need applause. It only needs to align with your values. When you are grounded in reason, you no longer need others to understand your choice in order to feel justified. Their confusion is not your responsibility. Their disagreement is not your burden. You know what you know, and that's enough. This kind of departure is especially difficult when there are loose ends, when things feel unfinished, when the other person never gave you the apology you wanted, when conversations still echo in your head, pulling at your need for resolution. But the Stoic way is not about tying every emotional thread into a perfect bow. It is about choosing to move forward even when things remain messy. Life is not a script. Sometimes the cleanest break is the one that doesn't look clean from the outside. You may find yourself tempted to explain one last time, to send that final message, to write that letter saying everything you've held back. And yes, it might feel good for a moment. But if you need someone else to finally get it in order to leave with peace, then your peace is still in their hands. The need to explain is often just another form of attachment. You're not communicating for clarity, you're fishing for validation. Quiet departure requires that you sit with the discomfort of not being understood, that you walk away with questions still hanging in the air, that you resist the urge to defend your name, your choices, or your truth. Because real peace doesn't come from others agreeing with your story. It comes from knowing you're living it with integrity. The Stoics didn't make decisions based on reputation. They didn't ask, "How will this look?" They asked, "Is this aligned with virtue?" And if the answer was yes, they moved, quietly, cleanly, without turning it into a performance. You don't owe anyone a dramatic ending just because the story was painful. Pain doesn't demand noise. In fact, it often demands the opposite, stillness. So, the healing can begin. This kind of exit also challenges the ego. The ego wants to be seen leaving. It wants the other person to notice, to regret, to chase. But the moment you do something for that reason, your action becomes reactive again. You're no longer leaving from a place of truth, but from a place of need. And the moment you need someone to respond in a certain way in order for you to feel strong, you've given away your power again. So what does a quiet departure look like? It looks like not replying when the conversation no longer respects your time or values. It looks like no longer trying to fix the unfixable. It looks like blocking someone without the need to tell them why. It looks like reducing contact, not to punish them, but to protect your peace. It looks like choosing silence over long debates, peace over proving, distance over drama. But none of that means you don't care. In fact, it often means you care deeply, just not at the cost of your own well-being. And when you make that choice quietly, you reclaim something more valuable than any reaction you could have gotten. You reclaim your inner authority. Leaving without noise also allows the other person to face their own silence. Sometimes, the greatest mirror we can hold up to someone is our absence. Not to hurt them, not to shame them, but to let them face their own behavior without us constantly responding, explaining, or absorbing the consequences of their actions. Silence does what words never can. It reveals truth. This doesn't mean you have to disappear suddenly or ghost someone without context, unless that's what's needed for your safety or peace. It simply means that once the decision is made, you stop engaging in cycles that go nowhere. You stop revisiting the same conversations. You stop giving your energy to what has already shown you it will not change. And here's something most people miss. Leaving quietly doesn't mean you're emotionless. It means you've already gone through the emotions. You've already felt the sadness, the confusion, the disappointment. But you've processed those feelings within, not projected them outward. You've chosen not to let those emotions dictate your exit, and that's what makes it powerful. The Stoics taught us that our emotions are not the enemy, but they must not be the master. When we act from a calm, reasoned place, we are no longer slaves to emotional waves. We become the stillness beneath the surface. That's why a quiet exit is not passive. It's deliberate. It's based on inner readiness, not outer pressure. It says, I've done the work, I've seen the truth, and now I walk, not to punish, but to protect my peace. This kind of exit also gives you back your time. When you no longer spend hours rehearsing what to say, waiting for the perfect moment, or crafting long explanations, you free up space in your life for healing, for growth, for clarity. You stop pouring energy into the story of what happened and start writing the next chapter. The people who truly respect your peace won't need an explanation for your silence. They will feel it, honor it, and perhaps even learn from it. But that's their path, not yours. Your job is not to teach people how to treat you by explaining. It is to live your boundaries with consistency, and nothing speaks louder than a person who acts from truth and doesn't need the world to clap for it. This also means letting go of the idea that you're responsible for how they feel about your leaving. You're not. That's their journey. Your role was never to carry their emotions. Your role was to be clear about your limits, and now that you are, let the rest fall where it may. Quiet departure is about completion. Internally, the chapter is closed. There's no need for dramatic punctuation marks. The story has ended. And because you've ended it with grace, not rage, you carry less emotional weight into what comes next. Many people think strength is in confrontation, but often it takes far more strength to walk away without it. To say nothing, not because you're afraid, but because you're finished, because you're at peace with your decision, and because you've realized that continuing to argue for your truth to be accepted by someone who never wanted to understand it is a waste of your life force. You are not leaving to win. You are leaving to be free. And freedom, real freedom, is quiet. It moves without announcement. It arrives without noise. It doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. It simply is. So let that be your practice, not just in relationships, but in every part of your life. When something no longer aligns with your values, when a connection consistently robs you of clarity, when staying costs you your peace. Let your departure be steady, not reactive. Let it be rooted in reason, not revenge. Because when you leave without needing to be seen, you have already become someone who no longer seeks permission to live in peace. And that, in itself, is liberation. Walking away quietly is a sign of strength. But even after we've stepped back, even after the noise fades and the conversations stop, there's something deeper that tries to hold us in place. It's not always the person we're leaving. It's the feeling of familiarity, the habit of having them in our lives, the comfort in the chaos we've learned to tolerate. And that's where the real challenge begins. This part is harder to notice because it hides beneath reason. It sounds like loyalty. It feels like commitment. But in truth, it's something else entirely. Attachment. And not the kind rooted in love or values, but the kind born from repetition, from routine, from a version of comfort that keeps us stuck. We get used to things. It's human nature. Even when something hurts, it can still feel safe if we've known it long enough. That's the trick of toxic attachment. It disguises itself as care, as patience, as devotion. But it's not any of those. It's just a pattern that hasn't been broken yet. The Stoics were not against love or connection. In fact, they deeply valued relationships that uplifted the soul and encouraged virtue. But they also warned against false loyalty, the kind that pulls us away from our highest self in the name of duty or obligation. To a Stoic, true loyalty is not to people or feelings. It's to reason, to virtue, to inner peace. One of the most dangerous illusions we fall into is believing that staying is proof of strength, that endurance in and of itself is noble, but endurance without direction is just stagnation. A person can stay in something harmful for years and call it loyalty. But what it really is, often, is fear. Fear of change, fear of loss, fear of being alone. We build identities around the roles we play in relationships. The helper, the forgiver, the one who holds everything together. And when you try to walk away from the relationship, you're not just leaving a person. You're being asked to let go of the identity you built within it. That can feel like tearing down a part of yourself. That's why it's so hard. That's why you question yourself even when you know it's time to leave. Habit is powerful. The mind, when left unchecked, repeats what's familiar. It doesn't ask if it's good for you. It just remembers what it has done before and defaults to it again. That's why we reach for our phones when we're anxious, why we go back to people who have let us down, why we explain ourselves to those who have never tried to understand. It's not logic, it's repetition. To change this, you have to interrupt the pattern. You have to pause and ask yourself, is this action aligned with the person I want to become? Not just how it feels in the moment, but whether it builds the life you truly want. This is what the Stoics trained themselves to do. Step back from their immediate emotions and observe. Question. Reflect. Only then act. Toxic attachment is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's the quiet discomfort you feel when they don't message you back. Sometimes it's the anxiety that shows up even after you've left. Sometimes it's the belief that without this person, your life loses meaning. But all of those feelings are signals that your identity has gotten tied up in something unstable. To untangle yourself, you have to reconnect with what's real. The Stoics believed in living according to nature, and part of that means honoring truth, especially the uncomfortable kind. If a relationship requires you to ignore your needs, suppress your values, or constantly abandon your boundaries, then it doesn't deserve the title of loyalty. It's just emotional dependency with a noble label. We often confuse history with compatibility. Just because someone has been part of your life for years doesn't mean they should be part of your future. Time spent is not proof of alignment. It's just proof that something lasted. And lasting isn't the same as thriving. Lasting can mean survival, not health. Don't let years together blind you to how much of yourself you've lost in the process. Attachment that's built on fear will always ask you to shrink. It will demand that you give more, explain more, stay longer. It will whisper that leaving makes you cold, that letting go means failure. But that's not truth. That's conditioning. And the only way to break conditioning is through clarity. Clarity comes when you stop asking how things feel and start asking what they are. Feelings are real, but they are not always right. You can love someone and still know they're wrong for you. You can miss someone and still be better without them. You can feel drawn back to chaos and still have the power to stay grounded. One of the greatest lessons Stoicism offers is the idea that discomfort is not a sign to go back. It's often a sign to move forward, because growth feels unfamiliar. Breaking attachment hurts, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. It means you're stepping out of something that no longer serves your well-being. When you feel yourself slipping into old patterns, take a breath and ask, am I acting from habit or from principle? That question alone can cut through the fog. Because once you start choosing based on virtue instead of emotion, your whole life changes. It's not about removing all emotion. Stoicism doesn't teach you to become numb, it teaches you to become wise. To hold your feelings in one hand and your values in the other, and to choose the path that keeps your soul intact, not the one that feels safe in the moment, but the one that builds the life you won't regret later. Another layer of toxic attachment is the belief that your loyalty can fix what's broken, that if you just love harder, they will change, that if you keep showing up, they'll finally see your worth. But this is not love, it's bargaining. It's sacrificing your peace for someone else's potential. The Stoics warned against this trap. They believed in focusing on what is, not what might be. To truly free yourself, you must stop loving people for who they could become and start seeing them for who they are now. You must stop rewriting reality to fit your hope. Hope, when disconnected from truth, becomes a prison. Toxic attachment also thrives in the space of unspoken expectations. You do more, hoping it will be returned. You stay silent, hoping they'll notice. But when you act from a place of silent negotiation, you turn your life into a guessing game. The Stoics rejected that. They believed in clarity, in speaking honestly, in setting expectations based on virtue, not wishful thinking. If someone cannot meet you at that level, it's not your job to lower the bar, it's your cue to step back. When your peace starts costing you effort just to maintain, you're no longer in a relationship. You're in a one-sided performance. And that is not loyalty, it's self-betrayal. True loyalty has a direction. It points toward growth, not survival. It supports mutual respect, not emotional dependence. If you find yourself in a place where staying means you must abandon your truth, you are not being loyal, you are being conditioned. Breaking that conditioning means facing discomfort head-on. It means letting go of the fantasy you built. It means accepting that the bond you feel might be nothing more than your nervous system responding to what's familiar. And it means choosing your values over your feelings again and again until your feelings start to follow your values. The beauty of Stoic practice is that it doesn't ask you to fix everything overnight. It asks for awareness, consistency, daily commitment to reason. If you find yourself slipping, you pause, you reflect, you return to center. There is no punishment for having loved too long, only the call to love more wisely from now on. You replace the old habits by choosing new ones, even when they don't feel natural yet. You start acting based on who you are becoming, not who you were in the dynamic. And each time you choose differently, your mind rewires itself. Your emotional attachment begins to weaken, not through force, but through clarity. You build new routines. You surround yourself with people who respect your boundaries. You engage in activities that reflect your values. You journal. You reflect. You stop feeding the old story, and you begin to write a new one. Not one based on pain or revenge, but on alignment, inner peace, and reason. Because ultimately, the only kind of loyalty worth keeping is the one that honors both your soul and your sanity. The rest is noise, habit, a pattern that can be unlearned. And when you do unlearn it, when you replace toxic attachment with rational allegiance to virtue, you don't just walk away from the wrong people. You walk toward the life you were meant to live. Quietly, steadily, without apology. Letting go of toxic attachment frees you from cycles that drain your energy, but as your clarity returns, a new challenge often appears: your compassion. Even after breaking the pattern, a part of you may still care. You may still want the best for the other person, still feel the urge to comfort, still think about their pain. That's not weakness, that's your humanity speaking. But here lies the test. Can you care without collapsing? Can you be kind without becoming a tool for their dysfunction? This is where many people fall back into old traps. After detaching, they confuse compassion with obligation. They hear a cry for help or see a glimpse of vulnerability and feel pulled back in. Not because the person has changed, but because their own guilt hasn't fully healed. The desire to do good becomes entangled with the fear of being cold. But compassion without boundaries is not virtue. It's self-abandonment in disguise. Stoicism teaches a kind of compassion that's both grounded and wise. It recognizes suffering in others, but does not make that suffering your responsibility to fix. It allows you to offer presence, but not at the cost of your values. It lets you feel love, but not become blind to patterns of harm. In other words, Stoic compassion does not ask you to trade your peace for another person's comfort. Empathy without wisdom leads to enabling. You may think you're helping by being available, by listening, by giving another chance. But if your kindness is allowing someone to avoid accountability, it's no longer compassion. It's participation. To truly help someone, you must be able to stand apart from their behavior long enough to see it clearly. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop sacrificing yourself for a version of love that never included your well-being. The Stoics reminded us that what matters is not how others act, but how you respond. Being kind doesn't mean allowing harm. Forgiveness doesn't mean returning to dysfunction. Understanding someone's pain does not mean excusing their choices. Too often, compassion becomes a trap when it's driven by ego, the part of you that wants to be seen as good, as generous, as needed. But this kind of self-image is fragile. It ties your worth to how others perceive your kindness. If they reject it, or if they continue their harmful behavior despite it, you begin to question yourself. But true compassion has nothing to prove. It stands quietly, offers what is right, and lets go of what is not yours to carry. If someone is hurting and they reach out to you, not with a willingness to grow, but with a desire to pull you back into chaos, Stoic wisdom asks you to pause. You ask, is this compassion, or am I stepping back into a cycle that damages us both? That question alone can change everything, because it brings clarity to what you're really doing, helping or avoiding your own discomfort with their pain. Compassion can exist in silence. You do not need to respond to every cry. You do not need to rush in every time they fall. You do not need to offer your presence just because they ask. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to let someone sit with the consequences of their actions, not as punishment, but as a path to growth. If you rescue someone from every moment of discomfort, they never learn to stand. And if they never learn to stand, they will always need you to carry them. That dynamic may feel like love, but it's dependency. And dependency that is not mutual or healthy quickly turns into resentment on both sides. Stoic compassion respects both yourself and the other person. It trusts that each of us has a path, and that interfering too much can actually make that path longer. When you constantly make excuses for someone, when you smooth over the damage, when you protect them from the consequences of their own actions, you are not helping them grow, you're helping them stay the same. Kindness doesn't mean fixing. It means seeing someone clearly, offering what you can give, and stepping back when your presence begins to replace their own accountability. That's the line between empathy and enabling, and crossing that line, even with good intentions, leads to exhaustion, confusion, and self-neglect. Many people confuse being available with being loving. But love without limits is not noble, it's directionless. And directionless love, like a river without banks, only spreads until it loses power. Stoic love is different. It flows within the shape of principle. It does not dissolve itself to avoid discomfort. You can care about someone's suffering without absorbing it. You can wish someone healing without offering your life as the solution. You can forgive someone and still keep your distance. These are not contradictions. They are signs of maturity. They show that your kindness is no longer reactive. It's conscious, intentional. And if the other person accuses you of being selfish for not sacrificing yourself again, it is not your job to convince them otherwise. People who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always resent their return. Let them. Your peace is not up for debate. Your compassion does not need their approval. There is a strength in soft-hearted people who know when to stop, who love fiercely but not foolishly, who give without guilt but also know when giving becomes damaging, who listen but no longer allow their kindness to be weaponized. This is not coldness, it's wisdom, a fire that warms without burning down the house. One of the hardest parts of this practice is recognizing when your empathy is being used against you. Manipulative people don't always come with red flags. They often come with stories, with needs, with just enough vulnerability to disarm you. They know how to lean on your compassion until you feel guilty for saying no. But the Stoics would tell you this: guilt is not proof of wrongdoing. Sometimes it's just an old reflex being challenged by new boundaries. If your compassion always comes with a cost, your sleep, your time, your emotional balance, it's not sustainable. And if it's not sustainable, it's not truly compassionate. Because compassion that destroys you will eventually turn into bitterness. And bitterness, even when justified, poisons your ability to show up in the world with openness. That's why Stoic compassion includes detachment. Not detachment from care, but from outcome. You offer kindness because it aligns with who you are, not because it will change the other person. You let go of their response. You release the need for it to be received well. That's true freedom. You're not responsible for what someone does with your kindness. You're only responsible for giving it without abandoning yourself. This also means removing the belief that your value lies in how much pain you can endure for others. That is not a virtue, it is a wound. A story probably learned early in life that says your worth is tied to being needed. But your worth is not a job, it's not a title, it's not a performance. It's already there, even when you say no, even when you choose rest, even when you stop carrying everyone else's burdens. The Stoics would have you ground yourself in what is within your control. And what's within your control is this: your intention, your behavior, your values. If you offer help, let it be because it aligns with those, not because you fear rejection or abandonment. That's how compassion becomes clean again, free of fear, free of ego. This also transforms the way you speak. When you've practiced clear-eyed compassion, you no longer speak from a place of trying to fix. You speak truth, not flattery. You reflect, not rescue. You show care through honesty, even if it stings, even if it creates distance. You know that sugar-coated support is not really support, it's manipulation in soft clothing. True kindness requires truth, and sometimes the kindest thing you can say is, "I care about you, but I can no longer be part of this." Not to shame, not to punish, but because your well-being matters too. Letting someone go while still wishing them well is an act of deep compassion. It's saying, "I love you enough not to enable your dysfunction, and I respect myself enough not to allow it into my space." It's not cruelty, it's clarity. A clarity the Stoics called living in accordance with nature, which means not forcing things to be what they are not, but allowing them to be what they are and acting accordingly. You can offer presence without permanence. You can show empathy without staying in harm's way. You can offer support from a distance. That's not withdrawal, it's wisdom. And when you begin to live this way, you stop carrying the weight of others' growth. You free yourself from the belief that your role is to fix what you didn't break. You let people learn what they need to learn in their own time, in their own way. That's what Stoic compassion looks like. It's rooted, not reactive, firm, not rigid, present, but not dependent. It is love without control, care without compromise, and peace, above all, at its core. When you walk in this kind of compassion, you no longer burn out. You no longer resent the people you help. You no longer give to be seen as good. You give because it's who you are, and you stop when it starts costing your balance. That's not just Stoic, that's strength. And it's the kind of strength that allows you to keep your heart open without letting it be pulled in every direction. Because compassion, when it is whole, creates freedom, not just for others, but for you. Once you've learned to offer compassion without losing yourself, the next challenge is what comes after. Being near the person without being pulled back into the pattern. Maybe you still have to interact with them. Maybe they're a co-worker, a family member, or someone you can't avoid completely. This is where your emotional discipline is tested, not just in moments of distance, but in moments of contact. And when contact cannot be avoided, indifference becomes your armor, not coldness, not cruelty. True indifference, as the Stoics understood it, is the ability to remain unmoved by what is outside your control. It is not a lack of awareness or care. It is the refusal to allow what others say or do to dictate your emotional state. In modern language, this is known as the grey rock method. It is the art of becoming uninteresting to someone who feeds on your reactions. It is how you protect your peace without needing to defend it. The key is consistency. You are not performing indifference, you are living it. You're not pretending to be calm while boiling inside. You are actually calm. And this requires more than silence. It requires mental discipline. Because people who rely on control, chaos, or emotional manipulation will try everything to break that stillness. They will use praise, guilt, bait, and even kindness as tools to draw you back in. Your task is to remain rooted. To master this, you start by withdrawing your emotional investment. You stop feeding the cycle. You stop chasing answers, proving your point, or expecting them to act with fairness. You release the idea that they will change because of something you do. Their behavior is not your project. Your peace is. Indifference is not passive. It's active control over what gets your attention and energy. You speak simply. You respond only when necessary. You stop oversharing. You stop explaining. You keep your tone flat, your reactions minimal, your expectations at zero. Not because you're hiding, but because you've chosen to stop playing a game you never agreed to. When someone sees they can no longer get a rise out of you, they begin to lose interest. That's the point. People who thrive on emotional control don't need you to agree with them. They need you to engage. As long as you're reacting, they have access. When you go still, their influence fades. The reason this works is not because you're being strategic, but because you've reclaimed your power over the one thing you truly control, your inner state. The Stoics called this self-governance, and they practiced it every day. In a world full of distraction, they trained their minds to remain steady, especially when others acted out of ego or emotion. This is not always easy, especially when someone pushes your buttons on purpose. When they try to provoke you through sarcasm, blame, or passive aggression, the natural urge is to defend, correct, or retaliate. But those urges are not commands, they are impulses, and Stoicism teaches you to pause before you follow them. To ask yourself, does this reaction serve my values or just my pride? When you learn to master that space between stimulus and response, you become immune to manipulation. Not because you are disconnected from reality, but because you're deeply connected to yourself. You know what matters. You know who you are. You do not need to prove it with every conversation. You are no longer living reactively. You're living deliberately. The grey rock method is powerful because it removes fuel from the fire. It makes emotional attacks pointless. It creates a boundary not by force, but by absence of emotional reward. And that absence, over time, does more than distance you. It protects your energy from further depletion. But don't mistake this for disconnection from life. Stoic indifference doesn't mean you walk through life numb or disengaged. It means you no longer attach your peace to things outside your control. You still care. You still feel. But you are no longer ruled by those feelings. You observe them. You honor them. But you do not act on them unless they align with reason. This kind of discipline changes the way you speak. You no longer explain things twice. You no longer justify your choices to people who aren't trying to understand. You no longer offer emotional access to those who misuse it. You become minimal in your reactions and generous in your clarity. You also begin to notice how much of your past communication was driven by the need to be seen, heard, or validated. The grey rock method helps dissolve that need. You begin to speak when it's necessary, not just when you're uncomfortable with silence. You begin to answer only the parts of questions that require answers. You stop filling emotional gaps in conversations just to avoid tension. This makes space for real connection elsewhere. When you stop giving energy to manipulation, You have more energy for people who value you. You no longer waste time on pointless emotional exchanges, and you begin to reclaim your attention for what matters: your work, your growth, your peace. A person who has mastered indifference doesn't appear distant. They appear composed. They radiate quiet strength. They listen without being pulled. They speak without needing reaction. They are harder to shake, not because they are hardened, but because they are anchored. And this anchor comes from within. You have to train it. It starts with awareness. The next time someone throws a verbal jab or tries to trigger you, pause. Feel the impulse rise. Feel the story your mind wants to tell. How unfair this is. How much they're wrong. Then ask yourself, is this where I want to place my energy? And then, do nothing. Say less. Show less. Not to hurt, not to punish, just to protect the space between you and the storm. Let their words pass through the air like wind through branches. Let your response be your stillness. Over time, you'll see that people who once had power over your peace no longer do. You'll see how rare emotional control is in a reactive world, and you'll become someone who brings calm instead of chaos. That's how the Stoics lived, not in isolation, but in mastery of the self. Some will try harder to provoke you when they sense you're calm. They will misinterpret it as weakness or passivity, but that is their confusion to resolve. Your stillness does not require their understanding, and your restraint is not a sign of defeat. It's a sign that you've stopped being ruled by noise. The grey rock method is not just for survival, it's for liberation. It allows you to move through difficult spaces without losing yourself, to engage when necessary, but not be emotionally drawn in, to remain present but unmoved. It's not about avoiding people, it's about protecting your soul. In practice, this looks like shortening conversations that go nowhere. It looks like no longer responding to bait. It looks like reducing contact, simplifying your tone, and walking away when the discussion becomes unproductive. It looks like peace, even in the middle of someone else's storm. And the more you live this way, the more your nervous system begins to trust you. Your body stops bracing for attack. Your mind stops racing for defense. You begin to rest in the knowledge that you are no longer at the mercy of anyone's chaos. You've stopped feeding it. You've stepped out. That's how you reclaim power, not by dominating others, but by refusing to be dominated by your own reactions. And when you reach that place, you don't need to prove your boundaries. You become them. There's a unique kind of freedom in being unshakable, not in a hardened, disconnected way, but in a steady, rooted way. You are still fully alive, still feeling, still caring. But nothing outside you owns your emotional life anymore. That's not just strength, that's Stoic strength. You begin to feel it in conversations. You no longer feel the urge to interrupt, to correct, to convince. You let others have their thoughts without needing to adjust them. You let silence stretch, not as a threat, but as a sign of self-control. You let drama collapse on its own from lack of attention. This discipline does not come overnight. It takes practice. You will slip, you will react. But the goal is not perfection, it's awareness. With each pause, each moment of stillness, each act of non-engagement, you build a stronger foundation inside yourself. Eventually, that foundation becomes the home you live in, a place of calm, clarity, and dignity. And no matter what chaos knocks at your door, you meet it with quiet strength. Not because it cannot touch you, but because you no longer need to respond to be free. Mastering indifference teaches you to stop feeding the fire. But what happens when the fire changes form? When it doesn't come at you with aggression, that arrives dressed in sweetness or subtle remarks meant to pull you back in. This is where manipulation evolves, where control hides beneath compliments, half-truths, or carefully aimed words designed to provoke, guilt, or confuse. This is not always obvious. That's why it works. And it's why you need to develop a new layer of awareness, the ability to recognize verbal manipulation and not take the bait. Some people don't need to yell to control you. They use language like a tool, sometimes a dagger, sometimes a flower. 1 minute they flatter you, the next they shame you. Not directly, just enough to stir doubt or push you off balance. This keeps you in their orbit, always second-guessing yourself, always trying to win back approval or prove your intentions. But approval that must be earned over and over is not real respect. It's leverage. Verbal manipulation often shows up when emotional control is no longer working. When you've stopped reacting to the obvious traps, they turn to subtle ones. A sarcastic comment hidden behind a smile. A compliment laced with criticism. A statement that sounds kind, but somehow leaves you questioning your worth. These words are not random. They're calculated, designed to hook you emotionally so you return to old patterns. The Stoics knew that words alone carry no power unless we assign meaning to them. Epictetus taught that it's not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. The same is true with speech. An insult is not pain, it's air and sound. A compliment is not truth, it's an opinion. Both become powerful only when you react. If someone says, "You've changed," and it's said with disappointment, your mind may immediately start searching for guilt. But pause. Ask yourself, is change a flaw or a step forward? What are they really trying to say? Often, when people can no longer control you through direct means, they try to control how you see yourself. They place subtle doubts into your mind and let you do the rest of the damage internally. That's why the antidote is detachment, not confrontation. You don't need to correct every remark. You don't need to prove you're misunderstood. You need to see the tactic clearly and refuse to make it personal. Verbal manipulation only works if it meets a sensitive spot inside you. Heal the spot, and the words lose their grip. Sometimes manipulation looks like praise. This confuses many people, but not all praise is sincere. Some compliments are transactional, offered to gain something in return. Some are exaggerated, meant to place you on a pedestal so that the same person can knock you down later. Some are designed to soften you right before a demand. If you're not grounded in self-worth, praise can become just as dangerous as criticism. It lifts you with one hand and leaves you exposed to the next blow. True praise uplifts without a hook. It's not wrapped in expectation or followed by pressure. It feels stable, not urgent. If someone uses flattery to gain your loyalty, they are not offering kindness. They are offering bait. And once you bite, you may find yourself giving more than you should out of a sense of obligation or misplaced gratitude. You don't have to reject all praise, but you do have to weigh it with clarity. Ask, does this compliment align with what I know to be true about myself? Is this being used to push me into something I'm uncomfortable with? Am I being praised for who I am or for how useful I am to them? The same clarity is needed when dealing with guilt trips disguised as care. Sentences like, "After all I've done for you," or "You're not the person I used to know," are not neutral. They are crafted to stir discomfort and make you question your boundaries. But healthy relationships don't demand repayment for love or understanding. They don't use the past as a weapon to shame you for growing. To deal with this, you must learn to see communication for what it does, not just what it says. Focus on impact, not intent. Manipulators often hide behind good intentions. "I was just joking. I didn't mean it that way." "You're too sensitive." But when a pattern repeats, when your peace is consistently disturbed by someone's words, that's no longer about misinterpretation. It's about control. The Stoics practiced clarity of judgment. They separated what belongs to the outer world from what belongs to their inner state. You must do the same with language. You can't stop people from speaking, but you can stop giving their words authority over you. You can hear something, assess its truth, and move on, without internalizing it or defending yourself. One of the most powerful things you can say to manipulation is nothing. Silence breaks the cycle. When you don't react to bait, it loses value. When someone throws an insult and you don't respond, you're not losing a battle. You're refusing to fight one that was never worth your time. That's not weakness. It's a high form of self-respect. At first, this may feel unnatural. If you're used to defending yourself, explaining your point of view, or proving your intentions, silence feels like surrender. But it's not. It's space. Space for your mind to stay calm. Space for truth to rise above performance. Space where manipulation has nowhere to grow. Another tool is directness. You don't need to mirror their subtlety. Speak plainly. If someone tries to twist your words, return to the core. "I don't feel comfortable with this conversation. I'm not going to explain myself again." That comment isn't helpful. Short, clear statements. No emotional decoration. No long justification. Verbal manipulation depends on confusion. It feeds on emotional fog. Your role is to bring clarity, not to please. And clarity doesn't always feel nice. It can disappoint others, but disappointment is not danger. It's just the sound of someone meeting a boundary they didn't expect. In this process, you also have to unlearn the need to be liked. This is difficult, especially if you've spent years adapting yourself to stay in people's favor. But the desire to be liked is often the doorway through which manipulation enters. When you're too concerned with being seen as nice, agreeable, or forgiving, you will accept words that cut you just to maintain peace. But that's not peace, it's performance. The Stoics aimed for self-respect, not approval. They trained their minds to focus on living rightly, not on being liked. You can do the same. When someone speaks to you in a way that feels manipulative, ask, "If I had no fear of losing this person's approval, how would I respond?" That answer will often guide you to truth. Verbal games lose power in the face of truth. Not shouting truth, quiet, steady truth. The kind that doesn't argue, the kind that doesn't flinch, the kind that sees through the performance and chooses not to participate. Even in professional or family settings, this can be applied. If someone makes a passive-aggressive remark during a meeting, you don't need to respond with the same energy. You can redirect, clarify, or simply remain neutral. Not because you're powerless, but because you've outgrown the need to prove yourself in petty arenas. You are not responsible for someone else's tactics. You are responsible for how long you keep handing them the script. Stop giving people the words they use against you. Stop filling silence just to avoid discomfort. Let space speak. Let stillness show you what's real. And if you've been manipulated through language before, release the shame. You are not weak for having believed kind words that turned into control. You were simply doing your best with the awareness you had. Now you have more. Now you see. And that's power. As you move forward, Train your mind to see through both insult and praise, not with suspicion, but with discernment. Insults are not identity. Compliments are not contracts. Both are opinions, and opinions are external, adiaphora. Neither good nor bad unless you let them define you. This is not about becoming hardened, it's about becoming clear. Soft heart, sharp mind. You can still be open, still be kind, still be present, but your value is no longer up for debate, not through words, not through manipulation, not through anyone's approval. You walk forward knowing this. Your peace is your responsibility. Your clarity is your protection. Your response, or refusal to give one, is your power. And no matter how clever the words may sound, they cannot touch a person who no longer sees them as truth. That's how you rise, quietly, wisely, completely, without needing to explain, without taking the bait, without losing your center ever again. When you stop reacting to verbal manipulation, something else tends to rise from within, not from the outside, not from the person you've detached from, but from your own mind. It arrives quietly, but it speaks with weight. It questions your choices, reminds you of your past, and whispers that maybe you were too harsh, too distant, too unforgiving. That voice is guilt, and it's often the last chain holding you back, long after you've broken free from everything else. Guilt can disguise itself as conscience, but they're not the same. One leads you back to your values, the other leads you in circles. One helps you correct your course, the other keeps you stuck in regret. If you're not careful, guilt will convince you that self-protection was selfish, that distance was betrayal, and that choosing peace means you've failed someone else. But guilt, when it's not rooted in reason, is nothing more than a shadow cast by fear and conditioning. Stoic philosophy makes a clear distinction between what we can control and what we cannot. You cannot control how someone feels about your boundaries. You cannot control the stories they tell about you or the way they frame your silence. What you can control is your intent, your clarity, and your commitment to virtue. And when you know that your actions were made in alignment with reason, that they weren't based on anger or revenge, but on truth, then guilt has no place. It's just noise, a residue of expectations that were never yours to carry. The guilt that lingers after you walk away is often tied to roles you were conditioned to play. Maybe you were the one who always kept the peace, the one who fixed problems, the one who stayed quiet to protect others from discomfort. Letting go of guilt requires letting go of those roles. It means acknowledging that being a good person doesn't mean being endlessly available. It means releasing the belief that your value is proven through sacrifice. Some guilt is inherited. You pick it up not from your own choices, but from the messages you were taught by family, culture, or society. Maybe you were told that choosing yourself is wrong, that prioritizing your mental health is selfish, that family must be tolerated no matter what. But those teachings, if they go against your well-being, are not virtue. They're control wrapped in tradition, and guilt born from them is not truth. It's programming. To truly live without guilt, you must examine what it's rooted in. Is it based on a violation of your own values, or just discomfort with someone else's disappointment? Did you do harm, or did you simply stop allowing harm to continue? Were you cruel, or were you finally honest? These questions matter because guilt is only useful if it reflects misalignment with your inner code, not with someone else's demands. If you acted out of impulse, out of reaction, out of fear, then correction may be needed. But if you acted from clarity, if you walked away from dysfunction, if you set limits to preserve your peace, then guilt has no voice in your life. It's not your job to feel bad for protecting your spirit. One powerful practice the Stoics used was the nightly review. They would reflect not with shame, but with honesty. Not to punish themselves, but to examine whether their actions aligned with their values. This is how guilt becomes guidance. You ask, did I live with courage? Did I act with justice? Was I governed by reason? If the answer is yes, then no opinion, no accusation, no disappointment from others can take away your peace. Guilt also thrives in silence, when you don't speak your truth, when you avoid your reflection. But silence is not the same as clarity. To be free from guilt, you must be willing to face yourself fully, to see where you acted in fear and where you acted in strength, to name the difference, and to forgive the past, not because it didn't matter, but because you are no longer that person. Some people won't understand your growth. They will call it selfishness. They will call it betrayal. They will weaponize your absence to make you feel like you failed them. But their opinion is not your moral compass. Their disappointment is not your wrongdoing. You must remember, guilt cannot be the measure of your goodness. Alignment must be. Peace must be. Integrity must be. Letting go of guilt also means accepting that not all wounds will be healed by your presence. Sometimes you will walk away and others will remain hurt. That does not mean you caused the pain. Sometimes pain comes from the disruption of a pattern, not from cruelty, and your absence may highlight truths they didn't want to face. That's not your fault. That's part of their journey. You are not responsible for healing others at your own expense. That belief is often where guilt finds its home. But you cannot save anyone by losing yourself. You cannot teach growth by modeling collapse. You can only serve the world from a place of clarity and strength. And guilt, when it goes unchecked, weakens both. If you find guilt still speaking loudly, pause, write it down, ask it questions. What is it accusing you of? Whose voice does it sound like? What story is it trying to preserve? Then challenge it, not with denial, but with truth. The truth of who you are now, the truth of what you chose and why, the truth of how far you've come. Guilt often fades not by being pushed away, but by being fully understood. When you see that the feeling no longer reflects your present self, it begins to dissolve. When you stop feeding it with shame, it starves. When you live daily in alignment with what matters most, guilt has no room to grow. You may need to forgive yourself, not because you were wrong, but because you were still learning. Forgiveness is not always about apology. Sometimes it's about releasing the belief that you were supposed to know better before you knew better. Growth is not linear. Healing is not perfect, and clarity does not mean you'll never look back. But you don't have to carry every version of yourself forever. You don't have to hold on to every mistake like a chain. You're allowed to release the past. You're allowed to evolve. You're allowed to be free. Freedom from guilt doesn't come from forgetting what happened. It comes from facing it honestly and choosing not to let it define who you are today. It comes from giving yourself the same compassion you've given others. It comes from refusing to measure your worth by someone else's emotional reaction. Letting go of guilt is an act of courage, because guilt often gives us a false sense of control. It feels like if we hold on to it, we're still doing something about the pain. But in truth, guilt only repeats the pain. It doesn't resolve it. Letting it go means facing the fact that you cannot change the past. You can only live better now. This is what the Stoics meant when they said to live according to nature, to accept what is, to act with reason, and to release what cannot be changed. Guilt keeps you stuck in what cannot be changed. Reason moves you forward. And when you live by reason, not regret, you begin to trust yourself again. You stop asking others for permission to feel peace. You stop needing everyone to understand your journey. You stop apologizing for evolving. You start walking with quiet confidence, knowing that your path may not make sense to others, but it makes sense to your soul. That's where your strength comes from. Not from perfection, but from alignment. So let guilt go, not because you don't care, but because you do. Let it go, not because you've forgotten, but because you've learned. Let it go, not to erase your past, but to honor your present. And most of all, let it go so you can live from clarity, not confusion. From purpose, not punishment. From virtue, not the echoes of voices that no longer belong in your mind. That is the freedom the Stoics wrote about. That is the freedom you now claim. Quiet, clean, without apology, and entirely your own. Letting go of guilt allows you to breathe again, to stand up straighter, to walk with a clearer sense of what is yours to carry and what is not. But once that burden is gone, you're left with something even more important, the responsibility to look inward, to not just ask what others have done to you, but what you may have done to others. Not to invite shame, but to develop integrity. This part is easy to skip, especially after experiencing pain or betrayal. But if you stop your journey at the wrongdoing of others and never examine your own reflection, then healing is incomplete, and so is your freedom. It's not enough to distance yourself from people who lack virtue. You must also ask if you've upheld your own, not in theory, not in the version of yourself you wish you were, but in your words, your actions, your reactions. The Stoics were relentless in their self-inquiry. They did not obsess over being good in public. They obsessed over being honest in private. They understood that cutting someone off is not just about setting boundaries, it is also about setting standards. And that means asking difficult questions about yourself before pointing outward. Epictetus told us, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." This is not just philosophy, it is instruction. You cannot become what you do not define. If your goal is peace, you must ask how you've contributed to conflict. If your aim is integrity, you must ask when you've traded it for comfort. If your hope is clarity, you must ask where you've been avoiding truth, especially with yourself. Self-examination doesn't mean blaming yourself for the actions of others. It means being courageous enough to see how you've shown up. Have you been consistent with your values? Have you reacted from emotion instead of principle? Have you held others to standards you didn't meet yourself? Have you used silence to manipulate or kindness to avoid hard conversations? When we ask these questions honestly, without the need to defend ourselves, we begin to develop the kind of character that doesn't just walk away from harm, it stops contributing to it. Sometimes what looks like setting boundaries is actually avoiding accountability. Sometimes what feels like protecting peace is actually suppressing truth. The only way to know the difference is to step back from your story and ask what's real, not what's comfortable. Your habits matter here, not just how you speak to others, but how you speak to yourself. Do you justify behaviors you would not accept from anyone else? Do you hold on to your pain so tightly that it becomes your excuse for staying unchanged? Do you act out your triggers without examining where they came from? Do you accuse others of manipulation while failing to admit when you've used guilt or silence to get what you wanted? Virtue is not theory, it's action. And virtue that is only expected from others is not virtue at all. If your standard is honesty, Have you been honest with yourself? If your value is respect, have you respected the boundaries you set or only enforced them when it was convenient? These questions don't weaken you. They build the foundation of a life that cannot be shaken. It's easy to label people as toxic. It's harder to look at the ways we may have responded with the same behaviors we criticize. Maybe you mirrored their emotional swings. Maybe you used their flaws to avoid your own growth. Maybe you clung to the role of victim to keep yourself from facing the fact that you had choices too. Not easy ones, but choices. No one is above self-examination, especially not those who claim to seek peace. The Stoics would say, peace without reflection is shallow, because you don't rise above chaos by avoiding it. You rise by learning how to meet it differently, starting from within. That's why they didn't just write about controlling the mind. They practiced it every day, especially in conflict. This practice must be done without self-punishment. You're not doing it to break yourself down, but to rebuild with intention. There's a huge difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt looks backward and asks, why did I do that? Responsibility looks forward and asks, what can I do differently next time? That is the path of virtue, not perfection, but progress. You also must ask yourself if your standards are clear or just reactions. Are your boundaries based on principle, or are they emotional walls built from fear? Have you cut people off from a place of calm clarity or from impulsive hurt? Did you leave because the connection no longer honored your peace, or because your ego was bruised and wanted to feel powerful? Being hurt doesn't make you right. Being calm doesn't make you wise. Being distant doesn't make you virtuous. These are outcomes. What matters is the motive beneath them. And that's where self-inquiry becomes a discipline. Not something you do once and forget, but something you return to constantly. Even now, as you move forward, you will be tested. New situations will arise. You'll meet new people. You'll feel familiar patterns calling you back into old habits. This is why self-awareness is not optional, it's your compass. If you don't examine yourself often, your actions stop being intentional and start being reactive, no matter how calm they appear on the outside. So check your motives. Ask yourself regularly, am I acting from alignment or from emotion? Am I treating others how I would want to be treated, even when they don't meet me there? Am I walking in virtue or just dressing ego in the language of boundaries? The point of this work is not to become invulnerable. It's to become honest. So honest that you no longer fear what you'll find when you look inward. Because you know that even if you uncover flaws, you have the courage to address them. You no longer need to be perfect. You only need to be true. This also changes how you view others. When you've examined yourself deeply, you stop needing to label people as villains. You understand that behavior often comes from pain, from unhealed fear, from patterns that go back years. That doesn't excuse it, but it does bring perspective. And perspective is what allows you to walk away with peace, not bitterness. It's not about letting people off the hook. It's about releasing the need to see yourself as entirely right and them as entirely wrong. That thinking keeps you locked in separation. When you've done your inner work, you stop cutting people off with a sense of superiority. You start creating space with a sense of clarity. Because you're no longer running, you're choosing. The greatest sign of someone who's walked this path well isn't that they've set the most boundaries. It's that their boundaries are aligned, not reactive. That they've looked in the mirror first. That they've cleaned up their side of the interaction, even when others didn't. That they've asked, how can I be better, before asking, why aren't they better? This is what gives you confidence. Not the confidence to confront others, but the confidence to face yourself. And when you can do that with honesty and compassion, your power becomes unshakable. Not loud, not defensive. Quiet, steady, and grounded in something deeper than emotion. Grounded in who you've decided to be. So the next time you feel tempted to blame, pause. The next time you want to walk away from someone, ask, have I walked toward myself fully first? The next time you set a boundary, ask, am I living by the same standard I expect? That's how you stay aligned. That's how you stay clean in your choices, even when others are messy in theirs. And when your conscience is clear, not because you've never stumbled, but because you've faced yourself honestly, then you move through life differently. You speak with more purpose. You act with more restraint. You detach with more grace, because you know the difference between reaction and reason, between surface peace and deep virtue. That's what makes your healing real. Not that you've never been hurt, but that you didn't let your hurt become an excuse to stop growing. That you didn't let someone else's failure become the reason you stopped holding yourself to a higher standard. You became the kind of person you were hoping others would be, not because they were, but because you chose to be. And that choice is what defines the life you live from this point forward. Not the pain, not the past, not the people who never changed. Just you, aligned, accountable, and free. Once you've taken an honest look inward, facing your own part, owning your values, and refining how you show up, something fundamental shifts. You stop reacting blindly. You begin acting from principle. But even when your intention is rooted in virtue, that doesn't mean others will respond with calm or reason. Not everyone you deal with will respect your clarity. Some will resist it. Some will challenge it. Some will try to provoke you. That's why even the most self-aware person must prepare for what comes next, potential conflict. Knowing who you want to be isn't enough. You must train yourself to remain that person under pressure. Not just when it's quiet, but when the air changes, when tension builds, when someone raises their voice, throws blame, or tries to throw you off balance. This is the test. And if you're not ready, your highest intentions will be replaced by your oldest instincts. The Stoics understood this, and they developed a practice for it. Premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. To put it simply, you prepare your mind by visualizing the worst that could happen, not to worry, but to train. You expect difficulty, not to live in fear, but to prevent surprise, because surprise is often what causes people to lose their temper, to react without thinking, to betray their values. When you anticipate conflict, you gain the power to respond, not from emotion, but from principle. This does not mean you become cynical. It means you become ready. You expect that people may not agree with you. You expect that someone may misinterpret your silence, your boundary, your honesty. You expect that old dynamics may reappear. You expect that even with clarity, someone else may choose defensiveness or blame. But by rehearsing this possibility, you remove its power to shake you. This kind of mental rehearsal isn't negative thinking. It's mental discipline. You don't dwell on the worst. You prepare for it. You go through scenarios in your mind. What if they interrupt? What if they accuse me? What if they twist my words? You run through each one, not to brace against them, but to walk yourself through how you will act, what you will say, what you will not say, what you will refuse to carry. This turns uncertainty into clarity. Conflict stops being a surprise. It becomes part of the terrain you're already equipped to move through. and that makes you harder to trigger. Not because you're emotionally distant, but because you've already chosen your responses before the moment arrives. The most common cause of regret during conflict isn't what someone else said, it's how you responded. The raised voice, the rushed words, the reaction you knew didn't reflect who you are. But in the moment, it overtook you. That's why mental rehearsal is so essential. It gives you space between stimulus and response. It slows things down. It gives you the power to stay grounded when everything else speeds up. This training also makes you more precise. You stop arguing out of habit. You stop over-explaining. You say what needs to be said clearly and without heat. You stay brief where others ramble. You become immune to bait. You stop trying to win. And in that quiet confidence, you gain influence without even seeking it. Some will still try to provoke you. They'll use tone, silence, sarcasm, even kindness to disarm your clarity. But if you've rehearsed your mindset, if you've already walked through the scenario in your mind, none of it sticks. You're not caught off guard. You recognize the pattern, and you stick to your path, not to prove anything, but because you've already made the decision on how you will act. This also includes preparing for your own emotional responses. You must know yourself well enough to anticipate your triggers. Maybe it's being misunderstood. Maybe it's being ignored. Maybe it's being blamed unfairly. Whatever it is, name it, study it. Ask yourself how it shows up. Then prepare how you'll meet it next time, what you'll say, what you'll breathe through, what you'll let go. And don't wait for the moment to practice. Do it daily. Walk yourself through hard conversations in your mind. Play out the tension. Feel the heat. Then practice staying calm. Practice keeping your voice low. Practice choosing your words. Practice pausing before speaking. These mental reps build the same strength as physical ones, but instead of training muscles, you're building inner stability. The goal is not to remove conflict from your life. That's impossible. The goal is to move through it without losing your principles. You can be direct without being cruel. You can be firm without being cold. You can end a conversation without raising your voice. You can walk away without slamming a door. This is real strength, the kind that doesn't show up as aggression, but as composure. Your preparation also helps you know what not to say. Because when you're prepared, you don't reach for words just to fill silence or protect your pride. You know what matters, and anything outside that becomes noise. You stop justifying. You stop defending. You stop trying to manage someone else's emotions through your words. You speak for clarity, not control. You also learn how to end things calmly, because some conflicts can't be solved. Some conversations aren't meant to reach agreement. And when you've mentally rehearsed that outcome, you can let go without needing resolution. You can say, "This is where I stand," and leave it at that. No bitterness, no final speech, just closure rooted in self-respect. The more you train, the more you detach from emotional outcomes. You stop basing your peace on how others respond. You no longer need agreement to feel valid. You no longer need understanding to feel clear. This internal preparation frees you, not from emotion, but from being ruled by it. This mindset also helps you when emotions rise unexpectedly. If you feel anger, you'll recognize it sooner. If you feel sadness, you'll give it space without letting it hijack your voice. If you feel overwhelmed, you'll know how to pause. That's the power of preparation. It doesn't remove emotion. It builds your capacity to meet it without being overtaken. It also protects you from post-conflict regret. When you've acted from preparation, You don't second-guess yourself after. You don't replay the moment, wondering if you said too much or too little. You don't ruminate for hours. You know you acted from your center, not from fear, not from pride, but from calm clarity. This clarity is not a gift, it's a result of practice, of daily reflection, of running through difficult moments in your mind, not to live in anxiety, but to build the kind of mind that doesn't fall apart when tested. Even if a conversation doesn't happen as you expected, even if the other person surprises you or the dynamic changes, your training still helps. Because it's not about predicting every word. It's about developing presence. You become the one in the room who doesn't flinch, who doesn't escalate, who doesn't abandon their principles just because things get tense. And people notice. Not because you're loud, but because you're still. And stillness has gravity. It pulls the situation toward resolution, not chaos. It invites others to meet you where you stand, not through force, but through presence. This is what Stoic conflict looks like. Not silence from avoidance, but calm from preparation. Not control through dominance, but leadership through example. Not disengagement, but full presence rooted in restraint. And if things fall apart anyway, you know you did your part. You showed up prepared. You didn't add fuel. You didn't betray your growth. That's how you sleep well. That's how you walk forward, not weighed down by reaction, but uplifted by integrity. Because in the end, this is not just about one conversation. It's about becoming the kind of person who brings calm to conflict. Not because life is easy, but because your mind is steady. You didn't wait for peace to be handed to you. You built it, one thought at a time, one response at a time, one prepared step at a time. Quiet, ready, clear, always. After practicing mental preparation, after choosing presence over reaction and clarity over control, there's one habit that still tries to sneak back in: your need to explain yourself. It doesn't arrive in anger. It shows up quietly, in the space after conflict, when you feel misunderstood or misjudged. That urge to defend your decision, to make someone see your side, to prove that you were right. But chasing explanation rarely brings peace. It pulls you back into conversations that were never meant to be balanced in the first place. This is where the discipline of silence begins. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of strength. The silence that comes from knowing who you are and no longer needing others to confirm it. The need to explain usually comes from the ego, not the honest, grounded self, but the part of you that still wants to be seen as the good one. The part that fears being painted as wrong. The part that can't stand the idea that someone may leave with the wrong version of the story. But when you reach a certain level of clarity, you realize something important. Not everyone deserves access to your truth, especially not those who have already shown they are unwilling to hear it. Stoic silence is not withdrawal from life. It is a form of participation rooted in reason. It says, "I will speak when it is useful, and I will withhold when it serves peace." You do not need to justify your every move. You do not need to narrate your healing to others, and you do not need to correct every false perception about you. Most of the time, explaining is less about truth and more about fear. When people don't understand your boundary, your distance, or your growth, they may accuse you of being harsh, ungrateful, distant, or cold. And if you still rely on their approval, you'll be tempted to explain. You'll want to make them see how much you tried, how much you cared, how difficult it was for you. But none of that guarantees understanding. In fact, the more you explain to someone who is committed to misunderstanding you, the more power you give away. The Stoics taught that what is aligned with truth stands on its own. It does not beg to be accepted. It does not tremble in the face of denial. It simply is. That is the Logos, the rational principle that underpins everything. And the Logos is never loud. It does not scream. It does not fight to be heard. It exists in calm certainty. When you begin to embody that principle, you'll notice a shift. You no longer rush to fill the silence after a boundary. You no longer answer questions meant to provoke, not understand. You no longer write long messages trying to explain your decision to someone who dismissed your voice when you were still speaking it softly. The less you explain, the more space you have to live. Every unnecessary explanation is a conversation you have with someone else instead of with yourself. It's a moment spent outside of alignment, bending your truth to fit someone else's comfort zone. And often, those who demand explanation are not seeking clarity. They are seeking control. They want your explanation so they can poke holes in it, or use it against you, or manipulate it until you doubt your own memory. Silence breaks that cycle, not with bitterness, with composure. It says, "I've said what needed to be said, and that's enough." No extra words, no long speeches, no footnotes to prove your growth. This discipline also means knowing when speaking is useful. Not all silence is wisdom. Sometimes clear communication is required. But here's the difference. Explanation that comes from peace sounds different than one that comes from fear. One is brief, direct, and grounded. The other is emotional, repetitive, and defensive. Before you explain, ask, is this about truth or my fear of being seen in a certain way? Is this about clarity or control? Is this explanation necessary? Or is it just my discomfort with being misunderstood? The truth is, you will be misunderstood. Even when you're honest, even when you speak clearly, even when you try your best. Some people are too invested in their narrative to make space for yours. Some will twist your words no matter how carefully you choose them. Some will resent your silence because it removes their ability to guilt you. That's not your burden. That's their journey. Your responsibility is to your own clarity, not their approval. And the deeper your clarity, the less you feel the need to explain it. This practice changes the way you show up in all areas of life. In relationships, you stop over-communicating just to soothe someone's anxiety. You start choosing your words more carefully. You realize that sometimes the strongest thing you can say is nothing. That refusal to explain doesn't mean avoidance. It means trust in your own judgment. In conflict, silence becomes a boundary. When accusations are thrown at you and you don't respond, you show that you've already removed yourself from the cycle, that you no longer need to fight for space in conversations that never offered you room in the first place. In healing, this silence gives you space. It keeps you from reopening wounds just to prove they existed. It lets you sit with your choices and say, I made that decision not because it was easy, but because it was right. And right doesn't always look right to others. That's fine. You didn't choose it for them. You also stop explaining your peace. You no longer feel the need to justify your boundaries, your solitude, your silence, or your choices. You stop trying to package your growth in a way that's digestible for those who never supported your transformation in the first place. You stop offering your life story to people who only want it to use against you. And in time, you realize that silence is not the absence of truth. It is the shield that protects it. When you hold your center, you send a message louder than words. I trust myself. I don't need you to understand my steps to know they were mine to take. Some will be bothered by this. Some will say you've changed, that you used to be so open, so available, and they'll be right. You have changed, but not into someone cold. You've become someone clear. And clarity, once reached, no longer explains itself. It acts, it lives, it moves forward. So next time you're tempted to over-explain, pause. Ask, what will this explanation change? Will it bring clarity, or just calm someone's discomfort? Will it bring resolution, or reopen something that's already closed? Most times the answer will be, nothing needs to be said. Not because you have nothing to offer, but because you've already offered everything worth saying. And now you're done. And now you're free. After learning to resist the urge to explain yourself, a deeper strength begins to settle in. But almost immediately, another test arrives. You stay silent. You hold your boundary. You walk away without drama. And then it happens. The reaction. Someone lashes out. They twist your choices into something selfish. They call your silence avoidance. They accuse you of being cold, uncaring, disloyal. And part of you still wants to fix it, to ease the discomfort, to make it okay. But that part of you must now learn its next lesson. Their reaction is not your responsibility. You are not responsible for how someone else feels about your truth. You are responsible for how you express that truth, calmly, clearly, and with integrity. But after that, the emotional response it creates in others belongs to them. It's not coldness to accept this, it's clarity. Because the moment you start taking on someone else's reaction as your own burden, you begin losing your center. Emotional detachment does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop confusing care with control. You can be kind and still stay grounded. You can offer compassion and still protect your peace. Detachment allows you to witness an outburst, a guilt trip, or an emotional spiral without absorbing it, without joining it, without letting it distort your clarity. This kind of strength doesn't come from disconnection. It comes from deep understanding. Understanding that people will often respond to boundaries with resistance, that someone who's used to access will experience your silence as rejection, that someone who is manipulated through emotion will experience your detachment as betrayal. But that reaction doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It means they are facing the discomfort of change. When you make a choice from reason, your job is complete. What happens next is no longer within your control. Trying to manage someone else's emotions is a form of overreach. It's subtle, but it's there. The belief that you are responsible for keeping others calm, comfortable, and pleased. But you are not here to carry their emotional experience. You are here to live with virtue. People often react not to what you said, but to what it symbolizes. Your silence may represent to them a loss of power. Your boundary may remind them of a past they haven't healed. Your distance may trigger an insecurity they've never faced. These things are not your fault. You may be the trigger, but you are not the cause. Understanding this frees you. It allows you to be present without becoming entangled. It allows you to respond without guilt. It allows you to walk away with empathy instead of shame. You can say to yourself, they are allowed to feel what they feel. I am not here to manage that. That's not a dismissal of their experience. It's a commitment to your own integrity. The Stoics taught that we must control what is up to us and release what is not. Someone else's reaction is never up to us. You can do everything right, speak gently, act calmly, explain clearly, and still be met with blame or anger. because their reaction comes from their mind, not your words, from their conditioning, not your actions. Letting go of responsibility for others' emotional responses doesn't make you cruel, it makes you honest. Honest about what you can actually do, honest about the limits of your influence, and honest about the fact that people have to walk through their own discomfort to grow. If you keep trying to absorb that discomfort for them, you rob them of the opportunity to evolve. You also rob yourself of peace. When you carry other people's emotional reactions, you make their pain the ruler of your life. You live in response to their moods. You make decisions based on how to avoid conflict. And eventually, you become a version of yourself shaped entirely by how not to upset others. That's not virtue. That's self-abandonment. True detachment means standing in your values while allowing others to have their feelings. You don't flinch when they get upset. You don't rush to soothe just to end the tension. You don't explain again when you've already spoken your truth. You simply stay grounded. You stay steady. You let the wave pass without reaching for it. This is what allows you to stay calm when someone accuses you unfairly. You don't take it personally because you understand they are speaking from their own filter. You may hear their words, but you don't absorb their pain as yours to resolve. You may even offer kindness, but not at the cost of your boundary. This also applies to guilt trips disguised as concern. When someone says, "I just don't know who you are anymore," or "You've changed so much," they may be trying to pull you back into old dynamics. You can listen, you can reflect, but you do not have to change course just to comfort them. Change that is rooted in growth will always be uncomfortable for those who benefited from your old patterns. When you internalize their reaction, you give it more weight than your own reasoning. And once that happens, your compass is no longer your own. It's in their hands. This is why the Stoics practiced emotional discipline, not to avoid connection, but to avoid distortion. Because emotion, when unexamined, can twist truth, and truth needs a calm mind to be heard clearly. Detachment also keeps you from falling into roles. When someone cries, you no longer rush to be the rescuer. When someone blames, you no longer become the fixer. You stay who you are, calm, clear, consistent. You allow them their feelings without taking on the job of resolution. This builds trust with yourself, because now you're no longer acting out of impulse. You're choosing your response from reason. You may still feel emotion. That's normal. Detachment is not numbness. You may feel sadness, disappointment, even frustration. But you allow those feelings to pass through you without controlling your behavior. You don't speak from them. You don't let them drag you into arguments. You acknowledge them, then return to your center. And you will find that many arguments don't even start when you detach, because most conflict needs two participants. If you don't engage emotionally, the energy has nowhere to land. You disarm the dynamic by staying still. There's a unique power in being the person who doesn't react, not with coldness, but with calm. You become someone others can't manipulate. You become someone who doesn't need to yell to be heard. Someone who doesn't need agreement to know what is true. Someone who doesn't need to be liked to remain whole. This steadiness makes you trustworthy to yourself, because now you're no longer confused about your role. You're no longer controlled by the opinions of others. You're clear on your values, and you act from them, not from pressure. Even when someone you care about reacts poorly, you hold steady. You can say, "I understand that you're upset. I still need this boundary." You can say, "I care about you, and I'm still going to make this decision." You don't say it with force. You say it with grounded presence, and that presence becomes your peace. This is not just strength, it's freedom. The freedom to choose your life based on reason, not reaction. The freedom to walk away without shame. The freedom to hold space for others' emotions without becoming a container for them. The freedom to stay connected to others without being consumed by them. So when the reactions come, and they will, pause. Breathe. Listen without attachment. Let their words pass like weather across a mountain. You are not here to fix them. You are here to live with clarity, to speak with intention, to act with calm, to love without losing yourself. And that love, when rooted in detachment, becomes something rare. It's not love based on approval or emotional management. It's love based on truth. The kind that can withstand any storm because it doesn't depend on control. It depends on presence. That is the heart of detachment. Not distance, but discipline. Not silence, but stability. Not rejection, but responsibility for your own energy. And once you master it, no reaction, not anger, not blame, not silence, can pull you out of your center again. You remain still, not because you're numb, but because you're clear, fully awake, fully alive, fully in control of what is yours, and no longer carrying what isn't. Once you've learned to detach from others' emotional outbursts, once you've stopped carrying the weight of their responses, you may think the hardest part is behind you. But something else starts to surface. The opinions of those watching from the outside. Friends, family, colleagues, acquaintances. They weren't there for the long conversations, the private struggles, or the patterns you've been trying to escape. Yet they begin to offer opinions, take sides, or hint at what you should have done differently. Some are subtle, some are loud, and even though you've found peace in your choices, their words can still shake your foundation if you're not prepared. This is the bystander effect in real life, not inaction in the face of crisis, but the pressure created by passive observers who claim insight without full context. It's the quiet, constant tug of social opinion, the raised eyebrows, the gossip disguised as concern, the well-meaning advice that doesn't understand your journey. And this is where many people falter, not because they doubt themselves, but because they begin to doubt whether they have the right to stand alone. The Stoics warned us about this. Marcus Aurelius, in the privacy of his meditations, said what few dare to admit. We care more about the opinions of others than we do about our own, even when we know the truth. Even when we've made choices with full awareness, there is still a craving for approval, a subtle desire to be seen as reasonable, as kind, as fair. And when third parties suggest otherwise, it feels like a threat, not to your decision, but to your identity. This pressure intensifies when the other person you've detached from starts telling their version of the story. Suddenly, people who were neutral begin to shift. They speak on things they didn't witness. They take sides without understanding both perspectives. And if you're not anchored in your reason, their judgment can pull you right back into emotional confusion. You start explaining again, defending again, questioning again. Not because anything changed, but because your peace was shaken by people who were never part of the story's depth. This is the trap. Not just the fear of being disliked, but the fear of being misunderstood. The belief that unless others agree, your clarity isn't complete. But this is false. Truth is not built on consensus. It does not require a crowd to confirm its strength. It only requires your own inner alignment. Third parties can only pull you back in if you leave space for their opinion to override your own. If you believe that reputation matters more than reality, you will keep reaching for explanation and performance. But when you place your self-respect above social comfort, You learn to stand in silence while others speculate. You learn to let people be wrong about you without losing sleep. This doesn't mean you isolate yourself or reject all feedback. It means you develop discernment. You ask, does this person know the full picture? Have they seen my growth, my process, my reasons? Or are they reacting based on one side, one story, or their own discomfort with confrontation? Most people avoid conflict, and when they see someone setting boundaries or walking away, they don't see courage, they see disruption. And disruption always makes the passive uncomfortable. Their discomfort is not your burden. Their misunderstanding is not your failure. Their silence in your struggle and their voice in your healing do not carry equal weight. When you understand this, you begin to move differently. You stop trying to earn back favor. You stop editing your life to appear more palatable. You stop apologizing for choices that took everything in you to make. You also stop using others' validation as proof you're on the right path. This is vital, because if their praise can affirm you, their disapproval can derail you. And either way, your center belongs to them, not to you. The Stoics believed that approval is fleeting, fragile, and often given for the wrong reasons. To chase it is to build a house on sand. One wave, one shift in opinion, and your peace collapses. You don't need everyone to understand your boundaries to hold them. You don't need the crowd's applause to move forward. You need clarity. You need reason. You need the ability to wake up, look at yourself, and know that you lived in accordance with what you believe is right. This kind of self-trust comes from consistency, from choosing your values even when it's not convenient, from holding the line even when people push against it, from letting go of the illusion that you owe the world a version of yourself that fits their expectations. Some will call you distant, some will call you difficult, some will say you've changed. And all of that might be true from their perspective. But perspective is not the same as truth. People don't see you as you are. They see you through the lens of their own stories, biases, and unmet needs. And no matter how carefully you speak, how softly you act, or how kindly you walk away, someone will still misunderstand you. Let them. That's not your responsibility to fix. If you spend your energy correcting every opinion, your life becomes a reaction to other people's perception. But your life is not theirs to define. It is yours to live, and your alignment will speak louder than their judgment ever could. The bystander effect also shows up when people urge you to keep the peace at the cost of your boundaries. They'll say, "Don't burn bridges," or "You should try again," or "Be the bigger person." These statements sound wise, but often they come from fear, not insight. From a discomfort with conflict, not a deep understanding of your experience. True wisdom does not ask you to betray yourself in the name of harmony. It invites you to live with integrity, even if that means standing alone. You may also face pressure to explain yourself to mutual friends, to extended family, to colleagues who are watching. And in these moments, your ego will tempt you to clarify everything, to make your case, to win back their approval. But ask yourself, who is this explanation for? Will it change the facts? Or will it simply soothe the part of you that still fears being seen as the villain? You are not a villain for choosing peace. You are not selfish for walking away from harm. And you are not cruel for choosing silence over endless explanation. You are human, growing, learning, aligning. And that alignment is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. It doesn't fight to be seen. It simply lives, consistently, patiently, without begging others to agree. You will know you've broken free from the bystander effect when someone questions your choice and you no longer feel the urge to defend it. When someone misjudges your silence and you don't rush to correct them. When someone chooses sides and you don't feel rejected, you feel free, because now you no longer depend on them to reflect your worth. You've found it within, not in rebellion, not in bitterness, but in calm, steady truth. The kind of truth that needs no witnesses. The kind of truth that stands even when no one claps. Once you let go of the urge to manage public perception, once you stop explaining yourself to bystanders who were never truly part of your journey, a deeper silence begins to settle. But within that silence, something uncomfortable can rise, a craving to be understood. Not by everyone, just by someone. The desire to be seen, to be heard, to have someone acknowledge that your decision was rooted in something real. This feeling is human. But if not examined, it becomes a trap. Because peace is not built on being understood. It is built on governing yourself in alignment with what you know to be right, regardless of who sees it. Self-governance is the inner authority that replaces the need for external validation. It is what allows you to act with conviction even when no one else agrees. It is what stops you from betraying your integrity just to be accepted. It is not about closing off or becoming rigid. It's about being able to move through life without constantly needing your actions to be approved, applauded, or emotionally rewarded. The need to be understood is natural, but when it becomes the foundation of your behavior, it weakens your stability. You begin tailoring your truth to make it easier to digest. You soften your boundaries so others won't take offense. You speak not to express yourself clearly, but to be liked, and in doing so, you drift from your center, not because your principles changed, but because you no longer felt safe living by them without applause. The Stoics didn't teach self-expression for the sake of being seen. They taught alignment. They valued clarity of thought and disciplined action. They knew that most of the world would never understand a person who chooses reason over reaction or stillness over performance. And they accepted that misunderstanding is often the price of inner peace. When you act from self-governance, you speak because there is value in speaking, not because you need others to agree. You clarify your boundary when it serves the situation, not because you fear being misread. You don't offer long stories about your past just to justify your present. You understand that your life is your responsibility, not a public statement waiting for commentary. The more you lean into this principle, the more uncomfortable it may feel at first, because we are taught that communication is clarity, and clarity is connection, but clarity is often mistaken for transparency. And transparency is not always required. You are not obligated to explain your every step just because someone asks. You are not wrong for choosing privacy over confession, and you are not closed off just because you no longer overshare. True self-expression is not about volume, it's about alignment. When your words reflect your values, when your actions mirror your beliefs, you are already living with clarity, even if no one else sees the full picture. That clarity is enough. You do not need your life to be understood like a story. It is not a performance. It is a practice. This doesn't mean you avoid connection. It means you choose it wisely. You express when it builds, not when it appeases. You speak when it adds, not when it protects your image. And you grow comfortable knowing that some people will misunderstand you no matter what you say, because their understanding is not shaped by your clarity. It's shaped by their lens. Some will hear your silence and assume indifference. Some will witness your boundaries and call it arrogance. Some will watch you walk away and call it cruelty. But none of that changes the truth if you are living it honestly. You were not put here to be everyone's version of right. You were put here to be aligned with what you believe is just and good and rational. Self-governance means you take ownership of your own mind. You stop needing permission to be at peace. You stop asking for consensus before making a decision. You trust your process enough to let it unfold without commentary. You no longer need the people around you to confirm your path because you've examined it. You've questioned your motives. You've refined your reasons. You've looked at your fear and chosen what aligns with virtue, not with ego. That kind of clarity doesn't always need to speak. It just lives. This is also why silence becomes a form of power. When you are governed internally, you no longer fear being quiet. You no longer need to broadcast your reasoning to feel solid in your truth. And when people question you, when they push for answers you've already made peace with, you don't react with panic. You don't scramble to justify. You respond with calm, or you don't respond at all. And even when doubt creeps in, when you start to wonder if maybe you should say more, prove more, explain more, you stop. You breathe. You return to your principles. You remind yourself that understanding is not the measure of truth. Alignment is. And that every moment you choose alignment over approval, you strengthen your self-governance. This makes you more consistent. You're no longer pulled in different directions based on who you're speaking to. You no longer adjust your story to fit your audience. You speak from one place, your values. You move from one foundation, your reason. And that consistency is what gives you long-term peace, even if short-term misunderstandings arise. It also helps you avoid overexposure, because sometimes the desire to be understood leads to oversharing, not from connection, but from fear. Fear that if people don't see all the context, they'll make the wrong assumptions. But the truth is, they might assume incorrectly anyway. And you might exhaust yourself offering every detail, only to realize that the people who truly understand you don't need all of that. And the ones who don't will never be satisfied, no matter what you share. So you become selective, not secretive, but intentional. You learn to speak with purpose, not for approval. You learn to hold space for your truth without needing it to be reflected back to feel real. And you learn to be misunderstood with dignity, not as a punishment, but as a necessary part of living honestly. This discipline also strengthens your relationships, because when you're not performing for others' understanding, you invite people into connection that's based on authenticity, not performance. You allow real closeness, not one built on constant explanation, but on shared values, mutual respect, and quiet trust. People feel the difference. They may not always know your full reasoning, but they can sense your steadiness. And that steadiness becomes a lighthouse, not because it demands to be seen, but because it doesn't move in the storm. This is the paradox of self-governance. The more you stop trying to be understood, the more deeply you begin to understand yourself. And once that happens, you no longer need approval. You no longer fear judgment. You no longer shape yourself to please anyone. You simply live, quietly, clearly, inwardly free. And that is where real peace begins, not when everyone sees your truth, but when you no longer need them to. After letting go of the need to be understood, you gain something much more valuable: room to observe yourself without interruption. When you're no longer adjusting your actions to gain approval or to shape others' opinions, a clear space forms inside you. In that space, the real work begins, not the kind that focuses on others, but the kind that turns inward with honesty. Because even when someone else behaves poorly, even when you're dealing with manipulation, blame, or judgment, there's still something vital to learn about your own reactions, your thoughts, your limits, your triggers. Every difficult person, every frustrating interaction becomes a mirror. This is where character is built, not in comfort, but in challenge. Not when people agree with you, but when they oppose you. When they test your patience, your self-control, your ability to stay grounded. This is not about romanticizing harm or pretending dysfunction is noble. It's about refusing to waste any experience. It's about taking even the hardest interactions and asking, what can I learn here about myself? The Stoics did not seek out suffering, but they trained their minds to find usefulness in adversity. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that people would be rude, ungrateful, deceitful, not to feel superior, but to prepare, to expect, to grow, to meet others' shortcomings with steadiness, and to use that discomfort as a tool to sharpen virtue. This mindset transforms the way you approach toxic dynamics. You stop being surprised, you stop making it personal, and instead you start learning. When someone pushes your boundaries, how do you respond? With defensiveness, with silence, with over-explanation. When someone twists your words or questions your motives, what part of you rises first? Is it the need to be right, the urge to attack back, the desire to retreat into bitterness? These moments are more than difficult. They are diagnostic. They reveal what still needs strengthening inside you. Each interaction is a kind of mirror, not because the other person is right, but because their behavior pulls something out of you. You might feel anger. You might feel small. You might feel the pull to fix or control. None of these reactions are wrong, but they are signals. They show where your work is. They show where your peace is still conditional, where your detachment still needs grounding. Using the mirror doesn't mean excusing harm. It means using it. If someone disrespects you, your response reveals your standard for self-worth. If someone lies, your reaction shows how tightly you cling to the idea that others must always be truthful for you to feel secure. If someone withdraws love, it shows whether you've built your identity on external validation. This doesn't mean that other people's actions are your fault. It means their behavior can teach you something, if you're willing to look beyond blame. Blame will always feel easier, but it keeps you powerless. It makes your growth dependent on someone else changing. That's not Stoic strength. That's stagnation. Stoic strength is asking, who am I becoming through this? Maybe the lesson is that you need to slow down your responses. Maybe it's that you're still emotionally entangled in someone else's perception. Maybe it's that you talk about boundaries more than you live them. Maybe it's that your compassion sometimes turns into over-responsibility. Every insight you gather becomes another piece of self-governance. Toxic interactions also highlight where you've grown. The things that once triggered you may now pass through you without reaction. The conversations that used to spiral into conflict now end with a calm, quiet sentence. You see the mirror and you respond with reflection instead of reflex. That's the kind of progress that can't be faked. It's felt, and it lasts. This inner refinement is not about becoming passive. It's about becoming selective with your energy. When you realize that someone's aggression doesn't require a response, you reclaim time. When you notice that someone's praise doesn't inflate you like it used to, you reclaim balance. You stop being pulled back and forth by the emotional tides of others. You become grounded, not because you've hardened, but because you've trained. And training requires repetition. There will be moments where you fail. You'll react when you wanted to remain calm. You'll speak when you meant to stay quiet. But even that is a mirror, not for judgment, for information. You ask, what pulled me out of alignment? And what can I adjust? The more you use the mirror, the less offended you become. You stop expecting others to act with the same level of awareness you've worked hard to build, and when they fall short, you don't spiral. You observe, you assess, you choose your next move from reason, not reaction. This also makes you more compassionate, not just to others, but to yourself. Because when you start to see that your own reactivity was never weakness, but untrained sensitivity, you stop punishing yourself for past behavior. You start guiding yourself gently but firmly toward better choices, toward clearer action, toward greater alignment. You learn to respond with precision. Not every comment deserves a reply. Not every provocation needs attention. Not every false narrative needs correcting. You conserve your energy for what matters, and you use difficult people as resistance training for your emotional strength. You also become more honest about your own tendencies. Maybe you've used silence as control. Maybe you've withheld emotion to feel safe. Maybe you've tried to gain love through compliance, or comforted others just to avoid conflict. These aren't flaws. They are learned responses, but they are not fixed traits. You can adjust them when you see them clearly, and difficult relationships often make those patterns easier to spot. So the next time someone brings out your frustration, ask, what is this showing me about myself? The next time you feel the pull to overreact, ask, what is being triggered in me and why? And the next time you catch yourself slipping into an old pattern, pause, breathe, realign. There's no benefit in pretending you're unaffected. You're human, but you are also capable of directing your growth consciously. You can use every test as material for self-mastery, not to be perfect, but to be more consistent, more thoughtful, more anchored in the kind of person you've chosen to become. Eventually, this mindset becomes automatic, not because you avoid pain, but because you've trained your mind to find value in it. You've stopped wasting energy on things that don't grow you. You've stopped measuring your peace by the absence of conflict and started measuring it by how you respond to it. And when the next difficult person comes into your life, and there will always be another, you meet them with quiet steadiness. You let them show you where your work is, and you thank them silently for the mirror, even if you never speak again. Because now you see what they can't. Every moment is a training ground for virtue. You don't just survive toxic situations, you refine yourself through them. You come out stronger, not in spite of them, but because of how you chose to respond. And that response is your power. The one thing no one can take. The one thing that turns every challenge into a path. The one thing that makes your peace unbreakable. After learning to use each difficult interaction as a mirror, you begin to notice a quiet shift. You no longer wait for peace to come from others, you create it from within. But even as your inner clarity deepens, something else becomes clear. If your external life isn't adjusted to reflect your internal standards, the tension returns. Not in loud, dramatic ways, but in subtle, daily moments. A lingering conversation that drains you. A text you feel obligated to answer. A meeting you attend out of guilt. These small interactions may seem harmless, but over time, they chip away at your peace. And this is where the power of small boundaries begins. Small boundaries are often overlooked because they don't create big scenes. But they are one of the most powerful ways to reclaim your life. They don't require confrontation. They don't need dramatic statements. They live in the quiet choices you make daily. What you say yes to, what you delay, what you quietly decline. These decisions seem small, but they carry massive impact. They are the structure that protects your clarity from erosion. You don't need to announce every boundary. You don't have to justify each limit you set. That's the beauty of restraint. When you move with purpose and don't seek attention for your decisions, your energy becomes more potent. You're no longer pouring time into proving your right to set boundaries. You're simply living by them. One reason small boundaries are so effective is because they prevent situations from escalating. When you set a limit early, when a pattern is still forming, you stop the problem before it grows. It's easier to adjust the course of a river at its source than when it's already flooding the valley. By recognizing discomfort early and responding with a gentle shift, you protect yourself without needing to defend yourself. Micro-boundaries look like ending a call when the conversation starts turning into gossip. They look like taking longer to respond to a message that pressures you. They look like politely declining invitations you don't have the energy for. They look like redirecting the subject when someone crosses into personal territory. They're not loud, they don't push people away, but they clearly signal, I am in control of how my energy is used. This kind of boundary setting doesn't need conflict to be valid. It doesn't need an audience. When you have internal clarity, your external life doesn't have to scream. It simply adjusts. People around you begin to notice, not through confrontation, but through your consistency. You show them who you are by how you behave, not by how you explain. There is a tendency to think that boundaries must come after a big event, a betrayal, a fight, an emotional collapse. But small boundaries are more preventative than reactive. They create space before the damage is done. They protect your time, your focus, and your nervous system from being constantly on alert. They keep you aligned with your values, even when the world around you is pulling you in 10 directions. The reason they work is because they build momentum. Every small no spoken in truth makes the next one easier. Every moment you honor your limit without apology teaches your mind that you're trustworthy. And when you trust yourself, you no longer fear losing the approval of others. That approval is no longer your currency. Clarity is. These boundaries also build respect. Maybe not from everyone. Some will be confused, some will test the limit, and some may withdraw. But the ones who belong in your life will adapt. They'll notice the integrity behind your choices. They'll adjust their own behavior, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. You've stopped negotiating your standards. Small boundaries also help you conserve energy for what matters. When you're constantly managing big emotional waves, you don't have the space to think clearly or live creatively. But when your life is structured with clear, consistent limits, your mind can rest. You're not always preparing for damage control. You're maintaining your peace with daily practice. The practice of setting these boundaries is also a mirror. It shows you where you still feel guilt, where you still think you need to justify rest, where you feel responsible for managing others' reactions. Each time you hesitate to draw a line, ask yourself, what story am I still holding that makes me feel I must always be available? Often the discomfort of setting a boundary isn't about the other person. It's about the internal belief that you must earn your worth by being endlessly open. The Stoics understood restraint as a form of power. They didn't value emotional shutdown, but they did value emotional discipline. Boundaries reflect that discipline. They say, I know myself, and I don't need to offer all of me just to feel accepted. They create structure so your freedom can grow within it. Think of small boundaries like trimming a garden, not to remove life, but to create space for it to thrive. You prune conversations, remove distractions, limit access, not to punish others, but to protect the peace you've built, peace that didn't come easily, peace that's worth defending. These boundaries also allow others to grow. When you no longer overfunction in relationships, you give others the chance to take responsibility for themselves. You step out of roles that were never yours to hold. You let people meet you where you are instead of chasing them with accommodation. That space may feel uncomfortable at first, but it's where real maturity begins. You also stop making exceptions that betray your principles. You stop saying yes because you're afraid of seeming rude. You stop replying immediately just to soothe someone else's anxiety. You stop attending things that leave you drained just to be seen as supportive. You begin to make decisions not from fear of reaction, but from alignment with your values. That alignment simplifies everything. You no longer need to explain yourself constantly. You no longer overthink every interaction. You trust your actions to speak for you. And the people who don't understand may fall away, but they were only holding on to a version of you that no longer exists. You replace performance with presence. You replace people-pleasing with grounded participation. You stop trying to be everywhere, for everyone, at the cost of your own well-being. You choose your center, and your life begins to reflect that choice. Not in big dramatic shifts, but in the rhythm of your day, the tone of your voice, the things you no longer allow. And when conflict arises, because it still will, your response is clearer. You're not responding from overwhelm. You're responding from a place that's already been protected by your daily discipline. You're not scrambling to regain balance. You've never left it. This is what freedom looks like when it's built from within. Not the kind of freedom that comes from escape, but the kind that comes from design, from being so consistent in your boundaries that your life begins to shape itself around peace. You don't need to yell your limits. You don't need to harden yourself. You don't need to isolate. You simply need to act from self-respect, to value your energy enough to treat it like it matters, not with rigidity, but with care. And in that care, everything begins to change, not through force, but through structure, not through argument, but through quiet consistency, not through dramatic exits, but through small, daily choices that speak louder than any explanation ever could. Once small boundaries become part of your life, something deeper starts to surface. You notice how much of your past behavior was shaped not by your values, but by expectations you never agreed to out loud. Agreements you didn't sign but followed anyway, patterns you inherited, roles you stepped into, emotional debts you kept paying, without ever questioning why. These are the unspoken contracts that quietly govern relationships, and breaking free from them often feels harder than walking away from direct harm, because they're invisible, but they still bind you until you learn how to undo them. An unspoken agreement can look like always being the one who listens, even when no one asks how you're doing. It can be saying yes to every favor because saying no would disrupt the balance. It can be absorbing emotional weight because somewhere along the way you learned that your peace wasn't as important as someone else's comfort. These are not formal arrangements. They're silent rules built from years of repetition, fear, guilt, and the need to belong. And they feel normal until they don't. The moment you begin setting boundaries, showing up differently, or even stepping back, the weight of these agreements becomes clear. You start feeling resistance, not just from others, but from within yourself. You feel guilt for not answering the phone. You feel anxiety for saying no. You feel disloyal for finally protecting your time. But these feelings don't mean your actions are wrong. They mean you're breaking an old contract that was never fair to begin with. Many of these agreements were formed early. You may have learned that love was conditional, that your value came from being needed, that your worth was tied to how much you gave, and so you adapted. You stayed small, agreeable, available. You didn't call it a contract back then. You called it connection. But now, with clarity, you can see the cost, and it's time to renegotiate. Renegotiation begins with recognizing that you don't owe anyone more than virtue and civility, not endless access, not emotional labor, not participation in patterns that keep you stuck. The Stoics taught that your duty is to act with justice, not with sacrifice. You are responsible for your conduct, not for maintaining relationships that ask you to compromise your well-being. Sometimes people don't react when you express a new boundary. They react because it breaks the agreement they thought was permanent. They depended on your silence, on your predictability, on your compliance. And when that changes, it disrupts the system. Not because you're doing harm, but because you've stopped accepting a harmful role. Undoing the unspoken agreement requires strength. It's not just about saying no, it's about enduring the emotional pressure that follows. You might be called selfish. You might be accused of abandoning people. You might even doubt yourself. But these reactions aren't truth. They're the discomfort of change. This is where your clarity must be stronger than your conditioning. You remind yourself that relationships built on expectation are not the same as relationships built on love. That approval bought through compliance is not real connection, that your dignity is not a price to pay for emotional security. You also learn that mutual respect does not require constant sacrifice. It requires truth. And the truth is, the people who benefit most from your silence will always resist your voice, not because they're evil, but because the system served them. Your change invites them to examine their own patterns. Some will, some won't. Either way, that part is not your responsibility. Undoing the agreement doesn't require drama. It requires consistency. You stop playing the role. You stop explaining the shift. You start acting from a new center. And over time, the system adjusts or dissolves. But the power lies in no longer needing it to validate your choices. You might still care deeply for the people involved. You might still love them. But love without freedom isn't love. It's emotional servitude. And staying in agreements that damage your sense of self does not make you loyal, it makes you invisible. Stoicism is about living in accordance with nature, and your nature is not to live in quiet resentment or to slowly fade for the sake of false peace. Breaking these contracts is not rebellion. It's reclamation of your time, your energy, your voice, your worth. You begin to relate from wholeness, not from a survival pattern. You offer kindness because it's real, not because it's required. You show up with truth, not with performance, and those who can meet you there become part of your real circle. The rest fall away, not by force, but by gravity, because what's no longer sustainable eventually ends. Sometimes these agreements are tied to culture, family, or history. That makes them heavier. But even then, they can be undone. Not through conflict, through quiet clarity. You stop showing up in the same way. You detach from roles that never reflected who you truly are. You act with respect, but you stop sacrificing yourself to meet expectations that were never yours. You don't need to explain this shift to everyone. Most won't hear it. They'll only feel the difference. And your peace, your calm, consistent, unshakable peace, will become the explanation. You won't need to justify it. You'll just live it. And in doing so, you'll create new agreements, spoken or not, ones built on mutual care, honest communication, and shared responsibility. Not emotional dependency, not guilt, not obligation. These new connections will require less effort, not more, because they won't need you to constantly prove your worth. You'll simply be allowed to exist, fully, clearly, without distortion. That's what happens when you stop playing old roles. You start writing your own terms, not selfishly, but wisely. You stop trying to be everything to everyone. You start becoming the person who doesn't abandon themselves just to be accepted. The shift may be slow, it may feel lonely, but in time, it becomes liberating. You don't need a clean break with everyone, you just need clean lines with yourself. And once those are in place, your life begins to change, not through force, but through quiet refusal to play parts that no longer fit. You're not breaking anything that was whole. You're releasing what was already unsustainable. You're ending agreements that required your silence. And in doing so, you're making space for something far greater. Relationships that are rooted in reality, in equality, in choice, not in a quiet, unpaid debt that never belonged to you. You walk forward, not bitter, but clear, not defensive, but free, because you finally understand you owe no one your erosion. You owe only truth, respect, and your own integrity. And that is more than enough. Once you begin undoing the unspoken agreements, once you realize you owe others only what is fair and virtuous, not your silence, not your emotional labor, not your constant availability, you will likely find yourself standing in a space that feels both unfamiliar and powerful. That space is called choice. And from it, you are now able to decide not only how to engage, but when not to engage at all. Because sometimes the most reasonable, most self-respecting response is not to explain, fix, or fight. It's to leave quietly, not as a dramatic exit, but as a deliberate, strategic withdrawal. Choosing absence doesn't mean you gave up. It means you stopped giving yourself away. When presence becomes a sacrifice of inner peace, the act of stepping back becomes an assertion of dignity. The Stoics understood this. They taught that virtue lives in right action, not in being everywhere, not in being endlessly tolerant, but in knowing when to retreat with discipline. There are times when your presence is misunderstood, when no matter how calmly you speak or how honestly you show up, the space doesn't allow for mutual respect. It's filled with reaction, with manipulation, with noise. And at a certain point, staying is no longer strength. It's surrendering your peace to chaos. That's when choosing absence becomes essential. You're not abandoning others. You're refusing to abandon yourself. Strategic withdrawal is not about running away. It's about choosing not to pour effort into places that do not return clarity, growth, or truth. It is stepping back, not to punish, but to protect. It requires no announcement, no justification, just a firm decision based on what your peace requires. This choice often comes after many attempts to fix what couldn't be fixed. It follows effort, communication, and patience. It arrives when you realize that being present is no longer useful, that your energy is being spent, not shared. It is a last form of self-respect, not as a reaction, but as a principle. Removing yourself can feel like defeat when you've been conditioned to stay, to prove your loyalty by enduring, to earn love by holding everything together. But endurance without purpose is erosion. And love that demands your silence is not love, it's control. Strategic withdrawal changes the way you define strength. No longer is it about how much you can tolerate. It becomes about how clear you can remain when everyone else wants you tangled. It becomes about how still you can stay when noise surrounds you. Strength becomes absence, not as avoidance, but as an intentional boundary. You will feel the urge to explain your silence. You will feel the impulse to soften the distance with kindness. But every time you reinsert yourself into a dynamic that isn't rooted in mutual understanding, you trade strategy for reaction. The Stoics would remind you that silence is not weakness. It is self-command. When you remove yourself, you give others the space to face their behavior without your interference. Sometimes your constant presence shields others from their own growth. They never have to see themselves clearly because you're always there to stabilize the imbalance. Withdrawal is not cruelty, it's space. And in that space, people either grow or they don't. But that is no longer your concern. Strategic absence is also powerful because it disrupts dysfunctional cycles. When someone expects you to engage, to argue, to over-explain, and you don't, it forces a pause. That pause is uncomfortable, but it breaks the script. It shifts the pattern, and in that shift, you begin to reclaim your energy. This absence is not cold, it's clean. It says, I have shown up, I have spoken clearly, I have done my part. Now, I choose not to participate in confusion. I choose to step away from what is no longer aligned with the values I live by. And you do this without needing to be seen. There is no applause for quiet exits. There is no celebration for setting down what was never yours to carry. But there is peace, a quiet, steady peace that builds when your life stops orbiting around, trying to be understood in places unwilling to understand. You also learn that withdrawal is not final. Sometimes distance creates room for clarity. Sometimes silence brings things to light. But whether the space becomes reconciliation or simply closure, it serves a purpose. The outcome doesn't matter as much as the principle. You stepped away because it was the most respectful thing you could do, for yourself and even for them. You'll notice how much time opens up when you stop engaging out of habit. You'll see how much lighter your day feels when you no longer carry conversations that go nowhere. You'll feel your mind begin to settle, your body to relax, your thoughts to move more freely, because you're no longer in a constant state of emotional negotiation. Choosing absence also helps you rebuild your internal authority. You remember that you don't have to explain your absence to earn permission for it. You don't have to justify why you need space. You are allowed to honor your own limits, whether or not others see their value. You'll meet resistance. People who depended on your compliance may call you selfish. Those who relied on your emotional labor may accuse you of being cold. But their discomfort is part of the system adjusting. Not because you've done wrong, but because you've done something unfamiliar. You've acted without seeking approval. You also start to recognize that absence teaches more than presence ever could. When you're no longer in the room to absorb blame, to soften conflict, to manage the emotional tone, people are left with their own behavior. That reflection is more powerful than any explanation you could offer. And sometimes that's the greatest gift you can offer someone. Space to see themselves without your buffering. Not as a punishment, as a truth. A truth that says, this is what the relationship feels like when I stop holding all the weight. Your strategic withdrawal can become a turning point, not just for your relationships, but for your life's direction. You begin to walk forward, not because you're escaping, but because you're done repeating, done waiting, done hoping that presence alone could fix what clarity already showed you. You also stop labeling your withdrawal as failure. You begin to see it as success. not of dominance, but of self-possession. You learn that peace often looks like letting go without fanfare, that it grows not from explaining the past, but from stepping into a future that doesn't require constant self-abandonment. And you come to trust absence as a tool, not to disconnect, but to realign. You begin to ask, where am I present out of guilt? Where am I engaged out of obligation? Where am I still offering access to someone who uses it to distort, not to connect? With those answers, you move differently. You stop asking whether people will understand your silence. You stop fearing whether they'll misinterpret your distance. You start living from a deeper truth. That virtue doesn't require permission. That discipline sometimes means walking away, not with anger, but with clarity. Strategic withdrawal is the closing of a door that needed to be shut long ago. Not slammed, just closed, slowly, firmly, and without apology. And on the other side of that door, you find yourself, not as someone who lost something, but as someone who remembered they were never meant to carry so much. You walk forward lighter, clearer, with more space to build a life that doesn't drain you. A life made of peace, that doesn't demand explanation. A life where presence is given, not expected. And where absence is not a weakness, but a choice made in quiet strength. Once you've chosen strategic absence, once you've stepped away without the need for noise or attention, what remains is the space you return to, your inner life. But absence alone isn't the final step. It opens the door, but what you do with the quiet that follows is what truly defines the next phase of your strength. Walking away doesn't end the emotional pull. It simply removes you from the immediate noise, the attachments, the unfinished thoughts, the emotional residue that all stays unless you clear it deliberately. And this is where the Stoic practice of energetic detachment begins. Energetic detachment is not about shutting down or becoming numb. It's about reclaiming your internal space. Just as you would clean a cluttered workbench before beginning a new project, your mind must also be cleared of the mental and emotional leftovers that remain after intense connections. You don't need anger to step away, but you do need clarity to move forward. And that clarity doesn't come from time alone. It comes from active reflection. The mind stores more than thoughts. It holds emotional memory, triggered responses, unspoken conversations, and lingering loops of what if and maybe I should have. These thoughts are not neutral. They are energetic threads pulling on your attention, pulling you back into what you've already left. And even if your body is no longer present, your peace will not be complete until your attention is fully reclaimed. The Stoics understood that emotional clutter clouds reason. If your inner world is filled with the residue of someone else's chaos, you will not be able to hear your own logic. You won't be able to see the present clearly if your mind is still rehearsing the past. That's why detachment isn't something you wait for, it's something you build. Start by becoming aware of what you're still holding. Not just memories, but roles. Are you still trying to be the one who was right, the one who cared more, the one who never gave up? These identities feel noble, but they're often tied to the ego, not to peace. Letting go of the role doesn't mean what you did wasn't real. It means you no longer need it to prove your value. The truth remains, even when you no longer carry the story. Clearing the inner table means questioning your emotional habits. Are you still replaying conversations that already happened? Are you still checking in on someone mentally every day, wondering if they're thinking about you, if they miss you, if they understand now what you meant then? These questions are subtle forms of reattachment. They keep your energy tied to someone else's emotional process, and that's no longer your task. The discipline here is in choosing what gets your attention. Not everything that calls for your energy deserves it. Not every memory needs revisiting. Not every thought is useful. The Stoics spoke often about the discipline of assent, the practice of deciding which thoughts to accept and which to reject. Just because a thought enters your mind doesn't mean it's yours to keep. You can acknowledge it without following it. Emotional detachment is not coldness, it's warmth turned inward. It's choosing to focus your care on the parts of yourself that need rebuilding. The time, the peace, the creativity that were paused while your energy was tied to someone else's inconsistency. That energy now belongs to your growth, your work, your purpose. But you can't access it fully until you let go of what's still taking up space. Sometimes what clutters your inner world isn't memory, it's fantasy. The imagined version of how things could have gone, the potential they once showed, the apology you still hope will come. These are the mental scripts that keep you stuck, not because they're evil, but because they're unfinished. But not all stories get a clean ending. Sometimes the only closure is realizing that no closure is coming, and deciding to move on anyway. Letting go of the story is one of the hardest parts of detachment. We don't just grieve people, we grieve the versions of ourselves we were with them. We grieve the future we were attached to. But grief is not a signal to go back. It's the process of freeing yourself from the weight of what could have been. You release this weight through small, consistent actions. You begin to limit how much space this person or dynamic takes in your mind. You stop checking their social media. You stop rewriting the past to make it easier to digest. You stop rehearsing comebacks or imaginary reconciliations, not out of bitterness, but out of discipline. Because every moment you spend in mental rehearsal is a moment not spent living the life in front of you. You also redirect your focus to things that strengthen you. Read something that makes you think differently. Build routines that bring clarity to your day. Connect with people who energize you instead of drain you. Let your world expand beyond the emotional pattern that once consumed it. Energetic detachment includes forgiving yourself for what you tolerated. It includes giving yourself compassion for staying longer than you should have, for explaining more than they deserved, for believing when there was no evidence. You don't need shame to change. You need understanding. You didn't fail. You were learning. Now you know better, so now you'll do better. This inner cleanup doesn't need to be loud. You don't need to make declarations. You don't need to announce your detachment. You live it in how you use your time, how you protect your attention, how you treat your emotional space like something sacred. You act as someone who no longer leaks energy into unreciprocated stories. You'll know you're clearing the table effectively when your triggers soften, when the thought of them no longer creates emotional spikes, when your body no longer tenses at the mention of their name, when silence becomes comfortable, not a space to fill. That's when your energy begins returning to you, not all at once, but slowly, steadily, in waves of clarity. You will feel moments of grief. That's part of it. But grief without reattachment is progress. Feel it, then release it. Don't analyze it. Don't turn it into another project. Just witness it and let it pass. Like clouds in the sky, your emotions don't need solving. They need space. Sometimes you'll feel tempted to re-engage, to reach out, to see if maybe now things could be different. But ask yourself, is this curiosity, or is it emotional residue? Is this love, or is it habit? Is this growth, or just an echo of the pattern you already left. The mind will search for closure until you teach it that closure comes from within. Not from their response, not from their apology, but from your own choice to stop carrying what is no longer yours. You give yourself closure by no longer living in reference to someone else's behavior. This is where peace grows, not in control, not in revenge, but in discipline. In the daily practice of reclaiming your space, redirecting your thoughts, honoring your boundaries, and living your life based on present reality, not past emotion. Energetic detachment is not something you wait to feel. It's something you build. One decision at a time, one mental shift at a time, one act of clarity followed by another. And over time, what once consumed you becomes something you barely remember. Not because you erased it, but because you've filled the space with something more honest, yourself. You become whole again, not because the past changed, but because you no longer need it to. You've cleared the table, you've made space for clarity, and now your soul can reason freely, steadily, without interference, without noise, with the quiet strength that comes from truly letting go. After clearing your inner space and reclaiming the energy you once poured into others, what often remains is the urge to make sense of it all. You've stepped away, healed, detached, and regained clarity. But now your mind looks back, less emotionally, more curiously. And what it wants to know is this: who was that person really? Were they cruel? Were they selfish? Were they broken? Were they trying at all? It's tempting to give them a title: villain, manipulator, narcissist. Something that explains the pain, something that justifies your decision. But while that might bring momentary comfort, Stoicism calls for something more courageous: understanding without labeling. You cannot move forward in full peace if you're still trapped in the habit of moralizing others. Defining someone as bad may help you set a boundary, but it also keeps you emotionally bound to them. Just as putting someone on a pedestal turns them into a reference point for your worth, demonizing them makes them the central figure in your pain story. And both roles, hero and villain, hold power over your peace. The Stoics believed that people act according to what they know, what they've been shaped by, and how much clarity they possess. Most people are not malicious by nature. They are unconscious. They are reactive. They are operating through fear, patterns, and deeply rooted wounds. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it places it in context. It brings the temperature down. Because it's hard to hate someone you begin to see as just another human being struggling with their own unresolved past. Labeling invites emotional entanglement. If you see someone as the one who ruined me, then your healing depends on disproving that narrative. You will look for validation, for revenge, for emotional closure that may never come. But if you see them simply as someone whose behavior no longer aligns with your path, you are free to leave without needing to rewrite the story. You also stop waiting for the day they'll realize what they did. You no longer need them to feel guilty, because when you remove the label, you remove the drama. You begin to live from a higher place, not moral superiority, but grounded neutrality. You accept that human beings are inconsistent, flawed, and often unaware of how their actions affect others. Even when the hurt was deep, even when the pattern was harmful, you can still choose to see the other person as someone lost in their own struggle. Not a saint, not a monster, just someone who did what they knew how to do, however inadequate that may have been. And now, your responsibility is not to change them. It's to stop orbiting around them. This perspective shifts the way you process memories. You no longer have to reframe every moment to fit your new narrative. You stop twisting the past to make yourself feel stronger. You stop deleting every good memory just to hold on to the anger. Because now you understand, a person can have moments of care and still be wrong for you. They can have intentions that seemed pure and still create harm. That paradox doesn't need solving, it needs accepting. Seeing the other person as a fellow struggler doesn't mean inviting them back in. It doesn't mean letting your guard down. It means leaving the battlefield. It means no longer needing to carry emotional weapons to defend your story. You still maintain distance. You still hold your standards, but you do it without painting them in black and white. This is especially important if you tend to internalize blame. If you've spent time wondering if you were overreacting or too sensitive, you may be tempted to label the other person just to feel sure. But certainty built on judgment is unstable. Real certainty comes from seeing things clearly, not emotionally, from naming patterns, not people, from identifying behaviors, not identities. When you stop creating roles, you also stop assigning yourself one. You're no longer the victim. You're no longer the fixer. You're no longer the fool. You're simply someone who had an experience. And now you're someone who has grown. This makes you more effective in future relationships because you're not carrying unprocessed judgment into new dynamics. You're not projecting traits onto others just because they remind you of someone from the past. You've let that old identity go, not because it didn't matter, but because you've outgrown the version of yourself that needed it. This perspective also teaches you humility. The moment you stop labeling others as inherently flawed, you open space to reflect on your own patterns. You stop asking, "What's wrong with them?" and begin asking, "What am I still healing that drew me into this dynamic?" That's not self-blame. That's self-inquiry. And it gives you power. Because you're no longer waiting for someone else to change, you're focused on evolving your own awareness. You begin to notice how you respond to emotional inconsistency, how you may have tolerated disrespect because you confused it with intensity, how you stayed longer than you should have because leaving felt like failure, how you kept showing up with love, not because they earned it, but because you didn't yet believe you could walk away without it. All of that becomes visible when you stop focusing on their character and start understanding your own growth. This does not mean downplaying harm. It means refusing to stay emotionally stuck in the frame of me versus them. It means moving into a state of personal sovereignty. You begin to say, "Yes, this happened. It hurt. It shaped me. But I do not need to carry a caricature of this person in my mind forever to validate my decision to leave." You begin to value internal balance more than external judgment. You choose peace over emotional righteousness. You let others be whoever they need to be in their own story, and you write your own without making them the antagonist. This choice brings unexpected calm. When their name comes up, you don't react. When a memory surfaces, you don't spiral. When they reappear in thought, you don't feel triggered. Because you no longer need to control how they are seen. You've stopped needing them to be the villain for your healing to be real. Instead, you recognize them for what they were. Another human on the path, maybe lost, maybe stubborn, maybe unwilling to grow, but not a monster, just a person. And in that truth, you finally feel light. Because you've put down the story you were holding, you've stopped carrying the emotional weight of proving your pain. You simply live, quietly aligned, knowing that you've moved forward not with bitterness, but with understanding. And that understanding is what turns experience into wisdom. Not because it justifies the past, but because it clears the way for a new kind of future. One where you no longer need labels to feel strong. One where peace is built not on defense, but on deep, clear seeing of others, of yourself, of the human condition we all share. You've now walked through one of the hardest paths any person can take. Not the loud breakups or explosive exits, but the quiet, deliberate journey of cutting ties with toxic people without drama. You've learned that true freedom begins not with confrontation, but with clarity. That silence isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That peace doesn't come from being understood by others, but from staying loyal to your own principles. You've discovered how to withdraw emotionally before walking away physically. You've seen the power of compassion without compromise, and how setting small boundaries can build a life of calm. You've trained your mind to rehearse conflict without falling into it. You've let go of guilt, of roles you were never meant to play, of emotional clutter that no longer serves you. And most importantly, you've learned that you don't need a villain to become free. You only need truth. This journey isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming clear. Clear enough to know what you'll no longer accept, what you won't explain again, and what you'll release with dignity. So now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and write, "I choose peace." Let it be your quiet declaration. Let it mark the beginning of your next chapter, one shaped not by reaction, but by reason. If this guide gave you clarity, strength, or even just a new perspective, subscribe to the channel. New content is coming to help you live more intentionally, with less chaos and more self-mastery. No drama, just truth. You're not walking away from people, you're walking toward yourself. And that's the most stoic move of all.